Welcome, restless minds, to another chapter from At Hollow Midnight, where the humdrum of history meets the peculiar. If you find yourself gently drifting, or perhaps just pleasantly distracted, remember to press that subscribe button. It truly helps us tell more of these delightfully mundane tales. Chapter 1. The Unusual Lodger. Elias Thorne had been traveling for what felt like 3 lifetimes, though in truth it had only been 3 days, each marked by the incessant, needle-sharp drizzle that seemed to penetrate the very marrow of his bones. His boots, once sturdy and reliable, now squelched with a mournful sigh at every weary step along the sodden, rutted track. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant peat fires, clung to him like a second, heavier cloak. He was a man of modest means, a purveyor of fine, if slightly flawed, timepieces, whose latest expedition had led him far off the beaten path in search of a particularly elusive clock mechanism, said to reside in the attic of a reclusive baron. The baron, it turned out, was less reclusive and more entirely non-existent, leaving Elias with a significant detour, an empty purse save for a few coppers, and a rapidly dwindling supply of patience, as dusk began to bleed across the perpetually gray sky, smudging the horizon with indistinct shades of charcoal and bruised plum. A faint glimmer of light pierced the gloom. It was the inn. The slumbering sow, its name painted crookedly above a sagging doorway, the lettering faded and peeling like old skin. A flicker of warmth emanated from its grimy windows, promising respite from the relentless chill that had settled deep within Elias's weary frame. He pushed open the heavy oak door, which groaned in protest like an ancient arthritic beast, and stepped inside. The interior was little better than the exterior. The air was thick with the mingled aromas of stale ale, forgotten cooking oil, and something indefinably musty that suggested long neglect. A single, flickering lantern hung precariously from the low ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted with every draught that snaked through the ill-fitting door. A few grizzled patrons huddled near a sputtering hearth, their faces illuminated in brief, orange flashes as they nursed their pints, their conversation a low, unintelligible murmur. Elias approached the counter, behind which a woman of formidable girth and an even more formidable scowl was wiping down a chipped mug with a cloth that had seen better centuries. "A room," Elias managed, his voice raspy from disuse and the cold. "Just for the night. Anything you have." The innkeeper, whose name Elias later learned was Agnes, grunted, a sound that could have meant anything from agreement to mild indigestion. She squinted at him, her eyes like 2 chips of flint embedded in a doughy face. "Rooms, eh? You're a bit late, aren't you, love? Place is packed tighter than a nobleman's breeches after a feast. Got a troupe of traveling acrobats in for the festival, and a particularly loud guild of tax collectors on their way back from the capital. Only thing left is the back room, and that's usually reserved for, well, for those who don't mind a bit of company." Elias felt a surge of despair. "Company?" he asked, his heart sinking further than his already sunken pockets. "You mean shared? With who?" Agnes shrugged, a motion that rippled through her considerable frame. "Just a quiet sort. Been here a few nights. Pays in advance. Doesn't complain. Says his business is esoteric. Doesn't bother anyone. In fact, might be better than the acrobats. They're still practicing their tumbling routines at 3 in the morning sometimes. The alternative of sleeping under a hedgerow, or attempting to brave the elements for another hour in search of a mythical next inn, was simply unthinkable." Elias pulled out his last few coins, their meager clink echoing hollowly in the otherwise dim quiet of the common room. "I'll take it," he said, resignation heavy in his voice. "Anything is better than another night in the rain." Agnes took the coins with a surprisingly delicate touch for a woman of her rough appearance, her gaze sharp as she counted them. "Room 7, she announced, pushing a heavy iron key across the counter. "Up the stairs, second door on the left at the end of the hall. Don't mind the draft near the window, and if you hear a strange sort of humming, just ignore it. He finds it soothing, apparently." Elias nodded, too tired to inquire further about the humming or the general strangeness of the situation. He gripped the heavy key, its cold metal a small comfort, and began his ascent up the creaking, groaning staircase. Each step was a minor triumph against the gravitational pull of his own exhaustion. The hallway upstairs was even darker than the common room. The single wall sconce at its far end, doing little more than casting a vast, impenetrable gloom. He fumbled along the wall, tracing the rough plaster until his fingers brushed against the wooden door, marked with a crudely painted 7. He inserted the key, the lock grumbled in protest, and with a final, weary push, the door swung inward. The room was small, with a single, unadorned window that rattled in a non-existent breeze. A threadbare rug covered most of the uneven floorboards, and a single, rather lumpy-looking bed dominated the small space. It was barely large enough for one person, let alone two, a fact that filled Elias with a renewed sense of dread. But his eyes, accustomed now to the dimness, registered something else immediately. The bed was indeed occupied. A figure lay stretched out beneath a surprisingly pristine white sheet, perfectly still, almost unnaturally so. Elias blinked, straining his eyes. Was the person asleep? They seemed to be facing away from him, their head barely visible above the pillow. A shock of unnaturally dark, almost charcoal black hair splayed against the white. There was a faint rhythmic sound, almost like a very low thrum, emanating from the figure, which Elias assumed was the humming Agnes had mentioned. He cleared his throat, feeling awkward and intrusive. "Excuse me," he ventured, his voice a tentative whisper in the quiet room. "The innkeeper said this room was available. I'm Elias Thorne. I appear to be sharing." There was no immediate response. Elias shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling the chill of the unheated room. He considered retreating, finding a hayloft. Anything. But the image of the relentless drizzle outside was a powerful deterrent. Just as he was about to try again, a slow, deliberate movement disturbed the figure on the bed. A head turned, slowly, smoothly, until a pair of eyes, luminous and unsettlingly bright in the dim light, fixed upon him. They weren't human eyes. Elias registered with a jolt that cleared some of the fog from his exhausted mind. They were the color of molten amber, with pupils that were vertical slits, like a cat's, but elongated, too long for any creature he had ever encountered. A moment of profound, unsettling silence stretched between them, thick and heavy like treacle. Elias felt the hairs on his arms rise, a primal warning shrieking in the back of his mind. He wanted to flee, to scream, to do anything but stand there, transfixed by those unnerving eyes. But before he could even formulate a single coherent thought, the figure in the bed stirred, pushing themselves up into a seated position with an elegant, unhurried grace. "Ah," a voice said, so smooth and mellifluous that it seemed to silk through the air, completely at odds with the strange feline eyes. "You must be the new arrival. Forgive my lack of immediate response. I was contemplating the subtle nuances of atmospheric pressure on a well-aged dust mote, a surprisingly engaging activity, particularly when one has had several centuries to hone the art of observation." The figure was clearly not human. The skin, visible now as they sat upright, was the color of old parchment, drawn taut over finely sculpted cheekbones. A pair of small, almost imperceptible horns curled just behind the ears, blending so seamlessly with the dark hair that they might have been part of an elaborate coiffure. And yet the posture was impeccable, the voice perfectly modulated, and there was an air of such cultivated politeness that it almost completely overshadowed the undeniable, screaming fact that Elias Thorne was sharing a room, and indeed a bed, with something entirely non-human. The creature swung its legs over the side of the bed, revealing slender, elegantly formed feet, tipped with what Elias could only describe as extremely well-manicured, dark talons, barely visible beneath the hem of a dark, silken nightshirt. It stood, and Elias saw that it was tall, far taller than he, and possessed of a lean, almost wiry frame. "My sincerest apologies for the imposition," the creature continued, bowing slightly, a gesture of old-world grace that felt utterly surreal in the dingy inn-room. "I was under the impression that the innkeeper, Agnes, had clarified the situation. I specifically requested that any potential lodger be made aware of the shared arrangement beforehand, and was assured that it would be communicated with utmost clarity. It appears there may have been a slight misunderstanding on her part." The demon for Elias could now think of it as nothing else gestured to the other side of the narrow bed. "However, since you are here, and the weather outside is, as I recall, rather inclement, please make yourself at home. I assure you, I am quite tidy, and I endeavor to be the most considerate of bedfellows. My name, for your records, is Xylos. Or, if that is too much of a mouthful in your current state of exhaustion, you may simply refer to me as X." Xylos extended a hand, the fingers long and slender, the nails impossibly dark and sharp. Elias stared at the outstretched hand, then at the unnervingly polite face, then back at the single, narrow bed. His mind, already reeling from days of travel and lack of sleep, struggled to process the information. A demon. A polite demon. A polite demon who wanted to share a bed in an inn called the Slumbering Saudekanane. The absurdity of it all began to chip away at the edges of his fear, replaced by a dazed, almost hysterical amusement. "Elias," he managed, finally finding his voice, though it sounded reedy and thin. He shook the offered hand, finding the grip surprisingly gentle, almost delicate, despite the talons. "Elias Thorne." "Yes." The innkeeper mentioned, humming, and something about esoteric business. Xylos smiled, a slow, elegant unfurling of lips that revealed teeth, perhaps a touch too sharp, but perfectly aligned. "Ah, yes, the humming. A minor relaxation technique. But some find it resonant. As for my business, it is indeed esoteric. I am, you see, a consultant, specializing in the subtle art of existential despair, among other things. A niche market, certainly, but one with surprising longevity. Though, I assure you, my professional interests do not extend to the discomfort of my temporary co-occupants." He paused, tilting his head slightly, those amber eyes studying Elias with an intensity that felt both piercing and strangely benevolent. "You look utterly spent, Mr. Thorne. Perhaps a moment to compose yourself. The basin is over there." He indicated a chipped ceramic basin on a small, rickety stand in the corner, "and I have a fresh bar of soap should you require it. It has notes of frankincense and myrrh. Quite invigorating after a long journey." Elias could only nod, his brain refusing to construct a coherent sentence. He stumbled towards the basin, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. The water was frigid, but he splashed some onto his face, the shock momentarily clearing his head. He glanced back at Xylos, who was now meticulously folding the corner of the sheet, ensuring it lay perfectly flat. "I trust you won't find my presence overly oppressive?" Xylos inquired, without looking up from his careful sheet-folding. I find that some mortals, particularly those unfamiliar with my kind, tend to project certain preconceptions. I assure you, I have no intention of causing you any distress, unless, of course, you would. I prefer a more traditional demonic experience. I am quite adept at the fiery torment, the whispering of insidious doubts, or even the subtle manipulation of dreams to induce soul-crushing dread. But I generally reserve that for my professional engagements. For a shared room, I find a more genteel approach is entirely appropriate. Elias swallowed hard. The frankness of the offer was so utterly disarming, so absurdly polite, that it nearly made him laugh. Or cry. He wasn't sure which. He dried his face with his sleeve, the scratchy wool doing little to assuage the surreal nature of the moment. No, he managed to croak. No, the, genteel approach sounds perfectly suitable. Thank you. Xylos finally looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. Excellent. I do appreciate civility. Far too rare these days, wouldn't you agree? Now, as for sleeping arrangements, I typically occupy this side of the bed. He patted the far edge of the mattress. I am a remarkably still sleeper, I assure you. No thrashing, no nocturnal ramblings, and certainly no spontaneous combustion, unless of course I am professionally provoked, which I highly doubt will occur tonight. You are welcome to the other side. I believe there is an extra blanket in the wardrobe, though I find the inherent warmth of this particular inn, combined with the subtle energetic output of the human form, quite sufficient. Elias just stared, his mind a slow churn of disbelief. He was being instructed on bed-sharing etiquette by a creature of obvious supernatural origin, who had just offered him fiery torment as an alternative to polite cohabitation. It was beyond anything his pragmatic, timepiece-repairing brain could comprehend. He pulled the extra blanket from the small wardrobe, its musty smell adding another layer of peculiar comfort to the bizarre tableau. He watched as Xylos, with another economical movement, settled back onto his side of the bed, his dark eyes now observing Elias with a quiet, almost contemplative interest. Is there anything else I can do to make your stay more comfortable, Mr. Thorne? Xylos asked, his voice a soft murmur that seemed to fill the small room. Perhaps a glass of warmed milk? Or a lullaby? I have a rather extensive repertoire of ancient incantations that can induce a most profound slumber. Free of charge, of course. Elias shook his head, too overwhelmed to speak. He simply pulled back the thin sheet on his allotted side of the bed, the rough linen a familiar scratch against his weary skin. He lay down, fully clothed, beneath the extra blanket, facing away from Xylos, though he could still feel the subtle thrumming of the demon's presence. He closed his eyes, hoping against hope that he might wake up and find himself in a perfectly ordinary empty room. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a foolish one. His journey, it seemed, had just taken a decidedly unusual turn. The rain outside continued its steady patter against the window, a mundane counterpoint to the utterly extraordinary circumstances within the humble inn room. And from the other side of the bed, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh of contentment seemed to drift through the air, followed by the faintest, most polite of hums. This was, Elias realized, what it was like to share a bed with a polite demon. And the night, though quiet, promised to be anything but boring. Chapter 2. The Demon's Introduction. The night had been surprisingly quiet. Elias Thorne woke to the thin, gray light of morning seeping through the rattling window of room 7. For a moment, disoriented, he thought the previous evening had been an elaborate, fever-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the persistent drizzle. Then, His eyes fell upon the other side of the narrow bed. Silos was there, precisely as he had been when Elias finally surrendered to sleep, utterly still. A dark silhouette against the paler sheets, breathing with a near imperceptible rhythm. There was no sound, no humming, no faint scent of brimstone. Nothing but the undeniable presence of something profoundly non-human, sharing his immediate personal space. Elias suppressed a shiver that had nothing to do with the chill in the room. He carefully, slowly, extricated himself from the confines of the bed, trying not to disturb his unnervingly polite roommate. His muscles ached, but the dull throb of exhaustion had lifted, replaced by a peculiar nervous energy. As he stood, stretching his cramped limbs, Silos stirred. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a languid, graceful unfolding, like a shadow lengthening in slow motion. Those amber eyes, with their unsettling vertical pupils, opened and fixed on Elias. There was no surprise, no grogginess, just that same quiet, contemplative gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." Silos's voice was a soft, silken murmur, perfectly modulated even so early in the day. "I trust you slept adequately." The air quality in these establishments can be rather pedestrian, but I find a strategic manipulation of localized atmospheric pressure can alleviate most nocturnal discomforts. Did you experience any lingering anxieties from our rather abrupt introduction yesterday? I do hope not. Elias cleared his throat. "Good morning, Silos." Or, I slept surprisingly well, all things considered. No lingering anxieties, no torti. Just a great many new things to ponder. He gestured vaguely at the room, and by extension, at Silos himself. Silos inclined his head, a gesture of elegant understanding. Pondering is, after all, a hallmark of the discerning mortal mind, and a valuable commodity in my particular line of work. He swung his long, slender legs over the side of the bed, the dark, silken nightshirt falling gracefully around his lithe form. The horns, just visible, glinted faintly in the weak morning light. "Would you care to partake in the inn's morning repast? I find their porridge, while lamentably thin on actual oats, does possess a certain, almost defiant, lack of flavor that can be quite cleansing to the palate. And the tea, while largely composed of hot water and the faint memory of a tea leaf, is at least hot." Elias, despite the peculiar invitation, found himself nodding. The thought of a warm meal, however uninspired, was a powerful motivator. He splashed cold water from the basin onto his face once more, attempting to banish the last vestiges of sleep and surrealism. When he turned back, Silos was already dressed. His attire was simple but meticulously kept, a dark, unadorned tunic of fine wool, tailored trousers, and soft leather boots. He looked less like a demonic entity, and more like a particularly fastidious scholar, or perhaps a very discerning merchant. Only the eyes and the subtle glint of horn betrayed his true nature. They descended the creaking stairs together, a study in contrasts. Elias, rumpled and still slightly bewildered, and Silos composed and moving with an unnerving, fluid grace. The common room was slightly brighter, the hearth now crackling merrily, though the air still carried the scent of stale ale. Agnes, the innkeeper, was already behind the counter, serving a plate of what appeared to be grayish porridge to a bleary-eyed drover. She merely grunted in acknowledgment as they approached, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Silos. A look Elias couldn't quite decipher. Was it fear, resignation, or simply the weary familiarity of someone used to the strange comings and goings of an old inn? "Ah, Mr. Silos, your usual then?" Agnes asked, her voice surprisingly deferential. "Indeed, Agnes," Silos replied, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "And 2 cups of your finest tea, if you please. My companion, Mr. Thorne, is also joining me for breakfast. He has, I believe, a nascent appreciation for the unique culinary offerings of the slumbering sow." Agnes merely grunted again, ladling out 2 bowls of the watery porridge. Elias found himself wondering how long Ixylos had been staying here, and what exactly Agnes knew about her peculiar long-term guest. They sat at a small, wobbly table near the window, the morning light doing little to improve the appearance of the food. "You see, Mr. Thorne," Silas began, stirring his porridge with a small, elegant spoon, "my preference for quiet companionship, as opposed to the more traditional manifestations of my kind, stems from a deeply ingrained sense of efficiency, and, dare I say, a touch of aesthetic sensibility." Elias, who had just managed to swallow a particularly gluey mouthful of porridge, merely blinked. "Efficiency? Precisely," Xylos affirmed, his amber eyes gleaming with a kind of intellectual satisfaction. "Consider the typical demonic modus operandi: fire, brimstone, screaming, elaborate rituals, dramatic pronouncements. All very theatrical, certainly, but also terribly resource-intensive. The constant production of heat, the management of spectral choirs, the meticulous scheduling of torment. It's an administrative nightmare, frankly. Not to mention the sheer noise pollution. One can barely hear oneself think over the wailing of the damned." He paused, taking a delicate sip of his nearly colorless tea. "And then there's the inevitable cleanup. Charred souls, melted infrastructure, a mess. It's simply not conducive to a productive existence." Elias found himself nodding slowly, despite the monstrous absurdity of the conversation. He had never considered the logistical challenges of eternal damnation. "My approach, however," Xylos continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "though perfectly audible in the quiet common room, is far more refined. It is about the ye-ace subtlety of despair, the quiet gnawing of regret, the slow corrosion of hope, the gentle nudging towards an existential ennui so profound it makes even the most vibrant soul feel like a lukewarm puddle on a rainy day. No fireworks, no screams, just a pervasive, inescapable sense of futility. It's far more sustainable, and the results are, in my professional opinion, far more enduring. A soul slowly crumbling from within is a far more exquisite sight than one merely scorched by external flame." He smiled, a chillingly gentle expression. "And this, Mr. Thorne, is where the preference for quiet companionship comes into play. How can one appreciate the intricate dance of quiet desperation if one is constantly bombarded by the cacophony of 1,000 tormented voices? How can one observe the fine lines of a breaking spirit if one is too busy orchestrating a pyrotechnic display? No, the true connoisseur of dread requires silence, requires observation, requires, dare I say, a modicum of good manners." Elias put his spoon down, feeling a distinct loss of appetite. "So, your consultancy isn't about grand infernal pacts? It's psychological?" Silos chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Ground infernal pacts are, alas, largely a thing of the past. The market for them has dwindled considerably. Mortals nowadays prefer to construct their own personal hells, often with remarkable ingenuity, and usually without any overt supernatural interference. My role is merely to provide guidance, to ensure they remain firmly on the path of quiet dissatisfaction. A well-placed doubt here, a subtly rephrased memory there. An almost imperceptible shift in perspective that leads them to question everything they once held dear. It's all about precision, Mr. Thorne. Like a finely tuned clock, if you will, but instead of marking time, it marks the slow decay of joy. He gestured vaguely with his spoon. This inn, for instance. It is a veritable hothouse of low-grade misery. The perpetually damp air, the vaguely unidentifiable smells, the lukewarm tea, it all contributes. And the inhabitants! Agnes, with her simmering resentment towards anyone who requests fresh linens. The drovers, weary from their thankless journeys. The occasional lost soul like yourself, Mr. Thorne, riper for a gentle nudge towards introspection on the futility of seeking elusive clock mechanisms. It's a rich tapestry of mundane despair. Elias felt a prickle of unease. He had considered his journey to be merely inconvenient, not a fertile ground for existential dread. I assure you, my despair is entirely due to the non-existent Baron and the ruined boots. Not any grand philosophical questioning. Xylos merely raised a dark, elegant eyebrow. Perhaps. But consider this. Why did the Baron prove non-existent? Was it merely happenstance? Or a subtle prompting? A whisper of a suggestion that there are some quests destined to fail? Some desires fated to remain unfulfilled, thus gently nudging you towards a deeper understanding of life's inherent meaninglessness. One never truly knows, do they? He smiled again, a hint of genuine amusement in his eyes. It's all about framing, Mr. Thorne. He then leaned back, stretching his long frame. And so, you see why I prefer a tranquil environment. The clamor and chaos of traditional demonic activity would simply interfere with my work. I need a clear head, a quiet space, and the opportunity to observe. And thus, when I encounter a potential shared lodging situation, I make it my absolute priority to ensure a peaceful coexistence. Loud snoring, for example, is entirely unacceptable, as are restless movements or the tendency to monopolize the available air. Fortunately, you, Mr. Thorne, seem to possess none of these undesirable traits. You are, dare I say, a rather ideal bedfellow. Elias stared at the demon, utterly dumbfounded. He was being evaluated, and apparently approved of, as a roommate, by a being who specialized in the quiet ruin of souls. The sheer audacity of it, the dry wit woven into such terrifying declarations, was disarming. It was impossible to be truly terrified when the threat of damnation was delivered with such exquisite politeness and a keen understanding of interior decorating. So, your presence here in this inn, is it also for work? Elias ventured, picking up his spoon again, though his porridge remained untouched. In a manner of speaking, Xylos replied, his eyes scanning the common room, taking in the various patrons with an almost scientific interest. I find it useful to maintain a presence among mortals, to stay abreast of developing trends in anxiety, to monitor the evolution of despair, to identify new avenues for gentle disillusionment. The human condition, Mr. Thorne, is an ever-flowing spring of fascinating neuroses, and occasionally I encounter a soul so exquisitely ripe, so perfectly poised on the precipice of profound melancholy, that it is simply too tempting to resist a small professional intervention. But always, with the utmost courtesy. He took another delicate sip of tea. This is, of course, far more efficient than the old ways of grand temptations and soul contract. Those required so much effort, so much paperwork, and the returns were often disappointing. Mortals, it turns out, are quite adept at self-sabotage without any external prompting. My role is merely to ensure they do so with a certain, elegant finality. Elias considered this. And your payment? How does one pay a consultant in existential despair? Silos gave a soft, amused chuckle. Ah, a practical question. A good sign. My payment is varied. Sometimes it is the simple satisfaction of a well-executed erosion of hope. Other times, it is the collection of certain energetic residues. Occasionally, it is a particularly rare vintage of human despair, bottled and aged, which I find quite invigorating. But more often than not, it is simply the pleasure of observation. The raw data of human suffering, refined and catalogued. It's a rather academic pursuit, in its own way. He finished his tea, placing the cup down with a faint click. Now, Mr. Thorne, I sense you have business to attend to. Perhaps related to the elusive clock mechanism. I would not wish to delay you. Unless, of course, you found our conversation so utterly captivating that you wish to prolong it. I am, you see, quite flexible with my schedule. Elias stood, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering dread. Relief that he hadn't been immolated. Dread that he was now privy to the inner workings of a polite demonic consultancy. No, I should be going. Thank you for the breakfast, Silos, and for the explanation. My pleasure. Mr. Thorne, Silos said, rising gracefully from the table. He stood taller than Elias, his dark eyes seeming to hold ancient depths. I trust our shared accommodations will continue to be mutually beneficial. Do not hesitate to inform me if my presence becomes in any way inconvenient, though I am confident it will not. After all, a truly well-mannered demon is a rare find in these tumultuous times. Would you not agree? Elias could only nod, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He was sharing a room and a bed with a demon who preferred quiet despair to fiery torment, and who critiqued the inn's porridge with the same precision he applied to the erosion of souls. The world, it seemed, was far stranger and far more polite than he had ever imagined. He stepped out into the gray morning, leaving Silos to his observations, and feeling an odd sense of morbid curiosity mingling with his lingering bewilderment. His search for a clock mechanism now seemed infinitely less complicated than his current lodging arrangement. Chapter 3. Negotiating Bed Space. Elias Thorne returned to the slumbering sow as the last vestiges of a perpetually gray day bled into an equally gray evening. His search for the elusive clock mechanism had, predictably, yielded nothing but damp trousers and a renewed appreciation for the term wild goose chase. He was, by this point, beyond mere weariness. He felt as though his very soul had been wrung out and hung to dry on a particularly damp clothesline. The thought of confronting the perpetually damp common room, the lukewarm ale, and the simmering resentment of Agnes the innkeeper was almost too much to bear. But the alternative, a night under the open, if drizzly sky, was still far less appealing than the prospect of a shared bed, even if his bedfellow happened to be a consultant in existential despair. He pushed open the heavy inn door, the familiar groan echoing through the common room. The usual suspects were huddled by the hearth, their faces obscured by the flickering firelight, their conversations a low, indistinct hum. Elias nodded curtly to Agnes, who grunted in return, and began his weary ascent up the creaking stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, his mind already anticipating the peculiar civility that awaited him in room 7. The door to their shared room was, as before, slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of light onto the darkened hallway. Elias pushed it open fully and stepped inside. Silos was already there, as still and composed as a perfectly rendered painting. He was seated on the edge of the bed, not facing the window as Elias might have expected, but rather intently examining the single, rather flat pillow that lay near the center of the mattress. His brow, smooth and unlined, was subtly furrowed in what appeared to be deep contemplation. "Ah, Mr. Thorne," Xylos said, without looking up, his voice a perfectly calibrated murmur. "You return. I trust your day was adequately unfulfilling." I detected a subtle but persistent tremor of disillusionment emanating from your general direction earlier. "Quite fascinating, how the human spirit can remain so robustly hopeful in the face of such consistent disappointment. A true testament to your species' resilience, or perhaps its stubbornness." Elias sighed, slipping off his sodden boots and placing them carefully by the door, trying not to disturb the thin, threadbare rug. "Unfulfilling, yes. And damp. Very damp." He approached the bed, noting the intensity with which Xylos was scrutinizing the pillow. "Is something amiss with the pillow, Xylos?" Xylos finally looked up, his amber eyes seeming to glow softly in the dim light. "Amiss? No, not precisely. However, I have been contemplating the optimal distribution of our respective bodily masses upon this rather regrettably singular sleeping surface, and it has led me to certain conclusions regarding the equitable division of bedding and the delineation of personal rest zones." Elias blinked. "Personal rest zones? We're sharing a single bed, Xylos. It's barely large enough for 1.5 men. Precisely the challenge," Xylos exclaimed, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of intellectual excitement in his voice. "A delightful logistical puzzle. Observe." He gestured to the pillow. "This single pillow, for instance. Its current placement suggests a communal use which, while superficially egalitarian, inevitably leads to a regrettable overlap of cranial territories. This, in turn, can result in suboptimal neck alignment for one or both parties, leading to discomfort and potentially disrupted slumber. And disruption, as we discussed, is anathema to my preferred working conditions." Elias rubbed his temples. This was going to be a long evening. "And your solution?" Xylos pointed a long, slender finger precisely down the middle of the pillow. "I propose a clear, albeit imaginary, dividing line. Each of us shall respect this demarcation. Your head, Mr. Thorne, shall occupy this half." He indicated the side closer to Elias. "And my own, this half." He tapped the other side. "No encroachment. No accidental nudging in the night. It is a matter of respect for boundaries, even invisible ones. Do you find this agreeable?" Elias considered arguing, but the sheer, polite earnestness of the demon was strangely compelling. "I suppose so. As long as I get my fair share. Fairness is paramount," Xylos affirmed with a slight nod. Indeed, I had also anticipated the potential for a disproportionate distribution of the blanket. This, he picked up the single, rather thin blanket that covered the bed, is clearly designed for individual use, or at best, for two very closely intertwined individuals, which, I trust, we are not. He held it up, scrutinizing its dimensions. Its dimensions are such that if one were to pull it entirely to one side in a fit of nocturnal selfishness, the other would inevitably be left exposed to the ambient coolness of the room. This, I dare say, would lead to profound resentment, which, while a fascinating emotion to observe, is not one I wish to cultivate in my immediate vicinity. So, what's your proposal for the blanket? Elias asked, genuinely curious now despite himself. Xylos lowered the blanket, spreading it carefully across the bed. I have considered several algorithms. The simplest and most equitable, given the circumstances, is a strict 50-50 division. However, this poses a problem at the central seam. One cannot simply slice it in half, as that would ruin its structural integrity. My solution, therefore, is a careful negotiation of overlap. I propose that the blanket be draped such that each of us receives precisely half of its surface area, with a minimal, mutually agreed upon overlap in the center. This overlap, perhaps, no more than the width of a human hand, designed solely to prevent a draft from entering the central seam. Any pulling beyond this agreed-upon limit would be considered a breach of our nocturnal accord. Elias stared. He was being lectured on blanket physics by a demon. A human hand's width? Precisely. Or perhaps a demon's hand, which is, admittedly, somewhat more slender. We can calibrate it tonight, if you wish, with a temporary measurement device. Perhaps a piece of string? Silos suggested, his eyes glinting with a truly disturbing enthusiasm for the mundane. No, no. A human hand's width is fine, Elias interjected quickly, imagining Silos meticulously measuring a string across the mattress. And what about accidental pulling? Sometimes one shifts in their sleep. Silos nodded gravely. An excellent point, Mr. Thorne. I have factored that in. I, for my part, am an exceptionally still sleeper. I assure you, my nocturnal movements are negligible, almost non-existent. Should I require repositioning, I execute it with conscious deliberation, entirely devoid of subconscious thrashing. I trust you endeavor to be similarly restrained? While I understand the unpredictable nature of human somnambulism, I would greatly appreciate a conscious effort to minimize any inadvertent blanket theft. Elias felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, quickly stifled. The demon was asking him not to unconsciously steal a blanket. I'll do my best, Silos. No guarantees when one's asleep. Silos sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible exhalation that carried no trace of exasperation. Merely intellectual acknowledgement. Understood. We shall consider it a gentleman's agreement, with a built-in margin of error for human frailty. A fascinating variable that. Now, beyond the bedding, we must also address the issue of personal space within the confines of the mattress itself. I propose again an imaginary, but rigidly observed, boundary down the very center of the bed. My side, your side. No crossing of the median without express, verbal permission. This ensures maximal individual comfort and minimizes the unwanted exchange of body heat, which, while naturally occurring, can become rather stifling in close quarters. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the worn mattress sag beneath him. You're very particular about personal space for a being that offers to share a bed. Ah? But that is precisely the point, Mr. Thorne, Silos replied, his amber eyes bright with intellectual fervor. The decision to share is a conscious one, predicated on certain agreed-upon parameters of civility and personal respect. It is not an invitation to promiscuous physical contact. One can be in close proximity without being entangled. Indeed, the very essence of true politeness, particularly in intimate settings, lies in the rigorous observance of such protocols. It is the framework upon which comfortable cohabitation is built. Without it, one descends into the barbarity of unconscious limb-flailing and uninvited snoring. Elias decided not to mention his occasional tendency to snore, especially after a long day. And the snoring, is that part of the uninvited category? Silas paused, considering snoring. While certainly a form of auditory imposition can be mitigated, I possess certain aural dampening capabilities. However, their deployment is resource-intensive, and I would prefer not to expend such energies unless absolutely necessary. Therefore, I would kindly request that you endeavor to maintain a respiratory rhythm conducive to restful slumber for both parties. Perhaps some deep breathing exercises before sleep, or perhaps a small, carefully placed obstruction in the nasal passages, such as a piece of wadded-up fabric. Elias held up a hand. I think I'll just stick to the deep breathing, thank you. Silos. The thought of wadded-up fabric in his nose, courtesy of a polite demon, was a step too far. As you wish, Mr. Thorne, though I assure you, my suggestions are always offered with your optimal comfort in mind. Now, with these fundamental principles established, I believe we can proceed with confidence into our shared nocturnal experience. Unless you have any counter-proposals regarding the establishment of our domestic tranquility, I am, as I mentioned, quite flexible, within reason. My primary objective is the absence of disruption. Elias looked around the small, dingy room. The rattling window, the musty smell, the lumpy bed, and now, the meticulously outlined rules of cohabitation with a demon. It was also utterly, preposterously absurd that he felt a peculiar sense of calm settle over him. The world was utterly mad, and he was simply living in its most polite asylum. No, Xylos, Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. No counter-proposals. Your terms seem perfectly reasonable, given the circumstances. A human hand's width of blanket overlap, strictly observed pillow boundaries, and a conscious effort on my part not to snore or flail. It's certainly a unique arrangement. Xylos nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in his amber eyes. Excellent. I am pleased we have reached such a swift and mutually agreeable accord. It speaks highly of your adaptability, Mr. Thorne. A valuable trait, particularly for a mortal in these unpredictable times. Many would simply resort to irrational fear or, worse, uncivilized behavior. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the small, chipped basin in the corner. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I shall perform my nightly ablutions. I find a brisk splash of cold water and a moment of contemplation on the ephemeral nature of all things quite invigorating before slumber. And the frankincense and myrrh soap, I assure you, remains entirely at your disposal. Elias watched, mesmerized, as Xylos moved with fluid grace towards the basin. Performing his ablutions with the same meticulous precision, he applied to blanket distribution. The demon even used a small embroidered linen square to dry his face, which Elias suspected was far too fine for an inn of this caliber. He then returned to his side of the bed, settling down beneath the blanket with an almost imperceptible rustle of fabric. He lay perfectly still, facing away from Elias, just as he had the night before. Elias, feeling a strange mix of fatigue and bewildered amusement, pulled back his side of the blanket, carefully ensuring his half-width of overlap. He adjusted the pillow, mentally drawing the invisible line down its center. He lay down, fully clothed again, the rough linen of the sheets, a familiar comfort against the utterly alien experience. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle patter of rain against the window, and from the other side of the bed he could just discern the faintest, most polite of hums, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in the very odd corners of his exhausted mind. He was sharing a bed with a polite demon, a demon who had just negotiated the most excruciatingly mundane details of their shared space. And in the strange, quiet world of the slumbering sow, it all seemed perfectly, if absurdly, normal. Chapter 4 Tour. The Demon's Midnight Snack. The quiet of the inn-room, broken only by the persistent, soft drumming of rain against the rattling window pane, had settled into a rhythm that Elias Thorne was inexplicably growing accustomed to. He had drifted off to sleep with the faint, polite thrum of Xylos' presence on the other side of the narrow bed, and the comforting, if bizarre, knowledge that his bedfellow was a demon who valued civility above all else. Even in the realm of shared blankets and pillow boundaries, he dreamt of finely wrought clockwork mechanisms ticking with preternatural precision, each gear turning with an almost audible politeness. A dream that felt perfectly in keeping with his new, strange reality. It was sometime in the dead of night, when the darkness outside was absolute, and the chill in the room seemed to press in from all sides, that Elias was gently stirred from his slumber. It wasn't a sudden jolt, nor a loud noise, but rather a subtle shift in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible scent that wafted across the room. It was not brimstone, nor anything overtly demonic. Instead, it was a curious amalgamation of something earthy, something vaguely metallic, and a note of something else. Something sweet, yet unsettlingly so. He opened his eyes, though the room remained plunged in profound darkness. He could just make out the silhouette of Silos, now sitting upright on his side of the bed. The demon was perfectly still, a dark, elongated shadow against the slightly less dark wall, and a faint ethereal glow emanated from his hands. It was the glow that had likely roused Elias, a soft pulsating light that seemed to shift between deep amber and a muted Venus red, and in Ixilos's cupped palms, bathed in this unsettling luminescence, rested what appeared to be a small, irregular orb. Elias, still half asleep and entirely bewildered, watched, unable to move. Xilos, as if sensing his awakening, turned his head slowly. Those unnervingly bright eyes, now luminous amber in the self-generated light, fixed upon Elias. There was no surprise in their depths, only that same quiet, contemplative gaze. "Ah, Mr. D." "Thorn." Silas' voice was a whisper, smooth as polished obsidian, yet perfectly audible in the stillness of the room. "My apologies for disturbing your repose. I did endeavor to be as discreet as possible. One must, however, attend to one's nutritional requirements, even in the late hours, and I find nocturnal sustenance to be particularly conducive to optimal systemic function." Elias pushed himself up onto an elbow, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Nutritional requirements? At this hour?" He gestured vaguely towards the glowing object in Silas's hands. "What is that? Exactly?" Silos offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "This, Mr. Thorn, is what I term a concentrated essence of despondency. It is a rather refined form of sustenance, quite unlike the crude dietary habits typically attributed to my kind." He held the orb aloft for a moment, and Elias saw that it shimmered faintly, a dark, viscous liquid contained within an almost transparent, yet strangely resilient, membrane. There was no visible blood, no gore, but the rich, almost cloying scent in the air was undeniably disturbing. "Would you care for a portion? I assure you, it is quite palatable, though the aftertaste can be melancholic, but in a rather sophisticated way, if one appreciates the subtle nuances of emotional decay." Elias recoiled slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around him. "No, thank you, Silos. I'm not particularly hungry at present, and I tend to avoid anything that tastes of melancholic, emotional decay. My constitution is rather more accustomed to porridge, however thin." Silos lowered the orb, though the faint glow from his hands persisted. "A pity. I find it remarkably invigorating. It provides precisely the kind of low-level, pervasive ennui that allows for truly contemplative work, unlike the chaotic energy derived from, say, a freshly reaped soul, which, while potent, can be rather distracting." One cannot formulate a truly elegant strategy for generalized disillusionment if one is still buzzing with the raw, untamed despair of a recently deceased tax collector. He brought the orb closer to his mouth, and Elias watched, morbidly fascinated, as Isilos gently broke the membrane with a single, elongated talon. There was no sound, no slurp, merely the fluid, graceful consumption of the contents. The light from his hands dimmed slightly as he did so, then slowly brightened again. Isilos sighed, a sound of profound, almost luxurious contentment. "Ah, splendid," he murmured, wiping a drop of the viscous liquid from the corner of his mouth with an elegant finger. A particularly fine vintage. This one had notes of unfulfilled ambition, a robust undercurrent of missed opportunities, and a delightful hint of existential dread derived from late-life regret. A truly complex bouquet. Elias, thoroughly unnerved, but also unable to look away, found his voice again. "So, you consume emotions? Is that your primary diet?" Isilos turned fully towards him, his amber eyes reflecting the dim glow of the orb that was now reforming in his palm, seemingly regenerating its contents. "Indeed, it is far more efficient than the traditional methods of sustaining a demonic form. Flesh is crude, and blood, while possessing certain energetic properties, is rather messy and culturally fraught. Emotions, however, are infinitely renewable resources. They are generated constantly, by all mortals, regardless of station or intention. Every sigh of disappointment, every flicker of doubt, every quiet moment of resignation, it is all a form of energy, ripe for the discerning palate." He paused, tilting his head. "And it is entirely sustainable. Unlike, say, livestock, which requires land, water, and considerable effort to raise. Imagine the logistical nightmare of maintaining a constant supply of sentient beings for consumption. No, emotions are far more environmentally friendly, and significantly less prone to resistance." Elias shivered, despite the logical, almost academic tone Isilos employed. "So my tremor of disillusionment from earlier, you could, theoretically, consume that?" Isilos chuckled, a low purring sound. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, I have been sampling your subtle emanations since the moment you entered this establishment. You are, if you'll forgive my candor, a rather delectable blend of weariness, mild annoyance, and a nascent yet persistent undercurrent of quiet frustration. Not enough for a full meal. Mind you, I would never be so impolite as to drain you entirely, but certainly enough for a small, refreshing aperitif. It's quite the complement to the ambient despair of the inn itself." Elias found himself speechless. He was being described as a delectable blend of weariness by a demon who treated his emotional state as a light snack. The absurdity of it was almost comical. "So, you don't need human sacrifices? Or souls? Souls are generally reserved for more long-term investments, Mr. Thorne," Isilos explained patiently, the orb pulsating gently in his hand. "And human sacrifices are so terribly archaic. They require far too much effort, and the mess, as I've mentioned, is simply not conducive to a productive work environment. The raw energy released by a violent death is potent, yes, but it lacks the nuance, the complexity, of a slow, simmering despair. Think of it as the difference between a crude, unrefined spirit and a finely aged brandy. I am, you see, a connoisseur." He gestured with the orb. "This, for instance, harvested from a particularly uninspired bureaucrat who had just realized his life's work amounted to little more than a meticulous arrangement of paper, offers a far more subtle and rewarding experience. The despair of quiet desperation. The slow realization of personal insignificance that is the true delicacy. Elias lay back, staring up at the low ceiling, trying to reconcile the meticulously polite, articulate being beside him with the terrifying implications of his dietary habits. So, when you consult on existential despair, you're also feeding? It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, Mr. Thorne, Xylos replied, his voice maintaining its perfectly modulated tone. As I guide an individual towards a more profound understanding of their own futility, the emanations of their developing despair become, shall we say, more robust. It's an incentive, of sorts. A performance bonus, if you will. I provide the guidance, they provide the produce. And I assure you, I'm a very ethical consumer. I never take more than is necessary. And I always ensure the individual remains fully functional, albeit slightly more despondent, for future harvests. He paused, and Elias could feel his amber gaze on him in the darkness. Are you quite certain you wouldn't care for a small portion? It might help you to process your own travel-related frustrations. A little taste of the void can be remarkably clarifying, particularly for the pragmatic mind. It helps one appreciate the small, fleeting joys that remain, even as one confronts the inevitable nothingness. Elias shuddered. No, thank you, Xylos. Truly. I think I prefer my void untasted, and my joys, fleeting or otherwise, to remain unclarified by existential dread. Xylos sighed, a sound that conveyed not disappointment, but a kind of gentle, knowing acceptance. As you wish, Mr. Thorne. It is, after all, a matter of personal preference. I find that mortals often resist the most efficient paths to inner understanding, preferring instead to cling to their illusions of purpose and meaning. A curious predilection, but one I have learned to respect, to a degree. It simply makes my work more challenging, and thus more rewarding. He then extinguished the faint glow from his hands, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. Elias could hear the soft, almost imperceptible sound of the orb being replaced somewhere on Xylos's side of the bed. Then, the demon shifted, settling back into his perfectly still, almost unnaturally composed sleeping posture. Well then, Xylos whispered, his voice a soft, final murmur in the profound darkness. Good night, Mr. Thorne. May your dreams be free of both existential despair and excessively loud snoring. I, for my part, shall continue to derive subtle sustenance from the ambient frustrations of this charming establishment. Elias lay there, wide awake, staring into the oppressive darkness. He was in a small, damp room in a remote inn, sharing a single, lumpy bed with a demon who consumed despair as a midnight snack and discussed it with the meticulous politeness of a sommelier. His attempts to find a clock mechanism now seemed utterly trivial. The world had tilted on its axis, not with a crash but with a quiet, polite hum. He could feel the subtle thrum of Xylos's presence beside him, a presence that was no longer terrifying, but merely profoundly, hilariously unsettling. Sleep, for a long while, seemed like an impossible feat. But at least, he thought, trying to find some solace in the bizarre, he wouldn't be woken by traditional demonic horrors, only by politely offered, emotionally charged, suspiciously bloodless snacks. The rain continued its steady, monotonous patter, a backdrop to the quiet, unimaginable strangeness of the night. Chapter 5. A History of Demon Roommates. Elias Thorne woke the next morning to the same persistent drizzle, a sound that had now become so utterly familiar it was almost comforting. The memory of Xylos' midnight snack, the glowing orb of concentrated essence of despondency, and the polite discussion of emotional consumption, still swirled through his mind like a particularly rich, albeit unsettling, dream. He stretched cautiously, feeling the familiar aches of a body accustomed to hard travel and uncomfortable beds, but also a strange, almost nervous energy. He glanced across the narrow expanse of the mattress. Xylos was as always perfectly still, his form a dark, elegant silhouette beneath the single, thin blanket, his rhythmic breathing, almost imperceptible. Elias half expected to see a faint, melancholic aura emanating from him, but the morning light was too thin for such phenomena. He carefully disengaged himself from the blankets, making sure to preserve the agreed-upon human hand's width of overlap. The chill of the room was a familiar companion, but the air felt, if anything, slightly less musty than usual, perhaps due to some subtle demonic atmospheric manipulation. As Elias pulled on his damp boots, their leather still stubbornly unyielding, Xylos stirred. It was the same languid, unhurried unfolding as the previous morning, those unnervingly bright amber eyes opening without a trace of sleepiness. "Good morning, Mr. Thorn," Xylos murmured, his voice as smooth and silken as ever. "I trust your slumber was undisturbed by any lingering anxieties regarding the ephemeral nature of all existence. I find that a good night's rest, even on an inferior mattress, can often provide a temporary, yet pleasant, reprieve from such weighty considerations." Elias managed a nod, pulling a comb through his perpetually unruly hair. "Surprisingly so, Xylos. Though I admit, my dreams were rather precise. Lots of perfectly aligned gears." Xylos inclined his head slightly, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "Ah, yes. A subtle influence, perhaps? I find that a touch of organized thought, even in the dreamscape, can be remarkably soothing for the mind. It allows for a more efficient processing of unconscious anxieties." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his movements as fluid and graceful as water. "Shall we descend for the inn's unique interpretation of a morning meal? I confess, I am anticipating the philosophical implications of the next batch of porridge." Breakfast was as uninspiring as ever. A thin, gray gruel that clung to the spoon with a sort of stubborn defiance, and tea that was, as Xylos had so eloquently put it, largely comprised of hot water and the faint memory of a tea leaf. Agnes, the innkeeper, merely grunted her usual morning salutation. Elias found himself, despite the bizarre nature of his companion, slipping into a peculiar routine. He ate slowly, when watching Xylos, who consumed his porridge with the same meticulous politeness he applied to every other aspect of his existence, seemingly tasting the very absence of flavor with a connoisseur's appreciation. "You mentioned yesterday, Xylos," Elias ventured, stirring his tea with a chipped spoon, "that you've been a consultant in existential despair for centuries. Does that mean you've shared rooms and beds before with other mortals?" The question felt absurd even as he uttered it, but his curiosity had, against all reason, begun to outweigh his apprehension. Xylos paused, placing his spoon down with a soft click. His amber eyes seemed to gaze into a distant past, perhaps beyond the grimy walls of the slumbering So, into epochs long forgotten. "A most astute observation, Mr. Thorn. Indeed, my professional activities, particularly those requiring close observation of the mortal condition, have often necessitated temporary accommodations in close proximity to my subjects. And, as you can imagine, in times past, private rooms were a luxury rarely afforded to the casual traveler, or indeed, to a demon requiring discreet operational cover." He took a slow sip of his tea. "My first prolonged shared lodging experience, if memory serves, was during what your historians refer to as the High Middle Ages, a rather rustic period, rife with delightful opportunities for subtle disillusionment. I found myself in a particularly squalid roadside inn, sharing a straw mattress. The bed, such as it was, consisted of little more than a pile of straw on a wooden frame with a peasant, a man named Grem. He was a simple, sturdy fellow, perpetually covered in the grime of the fields and the scent of sheep. Elias tried to picture it, a polite demon sharing a straw bed with a medieval peasant. The image was so incongruous it was almost painful. Grem, Sulos continued, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, was prone to rather robust snoring, a truly prodigious sound, like a particularly unwell boar, and his nocturnal movements were, shall we say, rather expansive. He possessed a commendable lack of self-awareness regarding his limb flailing. It presented a considerable challenge to my customary preference for stillness. However, one adapts. I merely ensured that his dreams were filled with such profoundly monotonous agricultural tasks, endless plowing of particularly rocky soil, the relentless mucking out of stables that never quite became clean, that his physical exertions in the dreamscape mirrored his real-world anxieties, thus subtly exhausting him more efficiently. He woke each morning surprisingly refreshed, if a little more resigned to his unending toil. He never suspected a thing, of course. Merely thought he was having particularly vivid dreams about his life. Sulos leaned back, a flicker of professional satisfaction in his eyes. And the scent, naturally, required some gentle atmospheric recalibration. A subtle manipulation of air currents to direct the more pungent effluvia away from my immediate vicinity, without causing Grem any undue suspicion or discomfort. One must maintain discretion, after all. He left, after a week, perfectly unscathed, though perhaps a little more convinced of the inherent futility of improving one's station. A rather elegant outcome, I thought. Elias could only stare. You influenced his dreams to stop him from snoring? Among other things, Mr. Thorne, Silos corrected gently. It was about maintaining an optimal sleep environment for both parties, and incidentally, providing a subtle push towards a more profound understanding of his own limitations. Efficiency, as I always say. And then, Elias prompted, morbidly fascinated. Later, Silos recounted, I found myself in the scriptorium of a rather austere monastery, posing as a traveling scholar. My accommodation was a narrow cot in a shared cell, alongside a Benedictine monk named Brother Thaddeus, a devout man, given to rigorous self-flagellation and extended periods of contemplative prayer. His despair, you see, was of a highly refined spiritual nature. He worried about the state of his immortal soul, the insidious nature of sin, and whether he had truly dedicated himself sufficiently to the glory of his deity. Xylos paused, his eyes gleaming. This was, for me, a particularly rich environment. I did not, of course, overtly tempt him towards apostasy. That would be uncivilized, and frankly, far too direct. Instead, I merely nudged his thoughts towards the inherent paradoxes of divine justice, the uncomfortable implications of free will, and the subtle, almost imperceptible hypocrisies he might observe in his fellow monks. His nightly meditations became increasingly introspective, focusing on the vast, unknowable distances between man and the divine, and the crushing weight of his own perceived imperfections. He would toss and turn, not from physical discomfort, but from the intellectual torment of spiritual despair. He survived that? Elias asked, genuinely surprised. Oh, quite, Silos affirmed. Indeed. He became quite renowned for the profundity of his sermons, which, while deeply inspiring to some, left others with a rather unsettling sense of their own spiritual inadequacy and the insurmountable nature of sin, or a delightful cascade of despair, really. And he never suspected his quiet bedfellow. He simply believed his spiritual journey had entered a particularly dark night of the soul phase. I, for my part, managed to sleep soundly, drawing subtle sustenance from his intellectual turmoil without ever physically harming him. He left the monastery years later, a celebrated yet profoundly weary ascetic. And bards? Elias inquired, imagining a drunken, singing menace. Bards? Xilos sighed. A sound that held a hint of nostalgic exasperation are a unique challenge. Their despair is often performative, designed for effect rather than deeply felt. And their hygiene, alas, often leaves much to be desired. I recall one particular incident. Many centuries ago, in a bustling market town, I was sharing a communal sleeping platform in a particularly boisterous inn with a bard named Lysander. He was a flamboyant fellow, perpetually smelling of cheap wine and unwashed linen, and given to composing impromptu ballads about his various romantic conquests, often at the most inconvenient hours. Silos shuddered almost imperceptibly. The noise, Mr. Thorn, the sheer, unbridled noise, and the dreadful harmonies. My preferred environment, as you know, is one of quiet contemplation. So, I took a different approach. Instead of inducing despair directly, I began to subtly influence his creative output. Every evening, as he would strum his lute and begin to improvise, I would gently introduce elements of existential futility, the transience of beauty, the inevitable decay of all things into his subconscious. His love ballads slowly transformed into laments for lost innocence, his heroic epics into tales of glorious, but ultimately meaningless sacrifice. He even composed a particularly moving dirge for a dead sparrow, which brought several patrons to tears. And he was all right? Physically? Entirely so, Silos confirmed. Emotionally, perhaps a little more prone to melancholy, but it actually elevated his art. He became known as Lysander the Somber, his ballads evoking a profound sense of world-weariness and the quiet tragedy of the human condition. He was highly successful, actually, and I, of course, ensured that his performance schedule, particularly his late-night serenades, became increasingly focused on the early evening hours, thus allowing for a more peaceful nocturnal environment. A true example of symbiotic cohabitation. Don't you agree? Elias rubbed his chin, a dazed smile playing on his lips. So you've never harmed anyone? Physically, I mean. In your sleep-sharing arrangements? Silos's amber eyes widened slightly, as if the very notion was preposterous. Mr. Thorn, such crude behavior would be utterly beneath me. It would violate every principle of polite conduct. My methods are precise, subtle, and entirely non-physical. The objective is to cultivate despair, not to inflict bodily injury. One does not, after all, damage the delicate flower. If one wishes to extract its essence, does one? My past bedfellows, whether peasant, monk, or bard, always left our shared space entirely intact, if perhaps a little more introspective about their own limitations or the general meaninglessness of their pursuits. It is, I assure you, a far more effective and sustainable form of engagement than anything involving claws or flame. He finished his tea, pushing the empty cup gently away. Indeed, I pride myself on my impeccable record of bedfellow retention. No complaints, no early departures, and certainly no accusations of demonic interference. Just a subtle, pervasive shift in outlook, a quiet disillusionment, gently nurtured over time. It is a testament to the power of politeness, even in the most unconventional of circumstances. Elias found himself nodding slowly, a strange sense of comfort settling over him. He was sharing a bed with a demon who had a centuries-long history of politely cultivating despair in his mortal roommates, all while maintaining perfect decorum and ensuring a quiet night's sleep. The absurdity of it was, in its own way, profoundly soothing. His problems, the non-existent Baron, the ruined boots, even the dismal porridge, seemed almost quaint in comparison. He was safe, physically at least. The existential dread, if it came, would be offered with impeccable manners and perhaps a side of seasoned melancholy. And as the morning light continued to filter into the common room, Elias Thorne, the weary traveler, realized he was perhaps the most surprisingly unscathed bedfellow Silas had encountered yet. Chapter 6. The Traveler's Skepticism. Elias Thorne woke for the third morning in room 7 of the slumbering sow, and for the third morning, the incessant, needle-sharp drizzle was a dull percussion against the rattling window. He stretched, feeling the familiar protest of his weary muscles, and glanced across the narrow expanse of the bed. Silas was, predictably, a perfectly still silhouette beneath the thin blanket. His presence a quiet, almost domestic hum in the room. The strange scent of earthy metallic sweetness, a lingering phantom from the demon's midnight snack, had faded, replaced by the persistent mustiness of the old inn. Elias found himself, despite the profound strangeness of the situation, growing accustomed to it. It was, he mused, a novel form of adaptation. One either succumbed to the absurdity or learned to politely coexist with it. Given his innate disposition towards pragmatism, he leaned towards the latter. He dressed in his damp, slightly stiff clothes, his thoughts already turning to the day's futile search for the non-existent clock mechanism. He still had a few coppers left, enough for another night, if he was careful. As he pulled on his boots, Silas stirred, unfolding with his usual languid grace. Those unnervingly bright amber eyes opened, focusing on Elias with an intensity that suggested a complete absence of the human need for waking. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Silas murmured, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "I trust your brief interlude with the realm of dreams was sufficiently unturbulent? I detected a slight perturbation in your sleep cycle around the 4th hour, a fleeting anxiety, perhaps related to the proper tensioning of a mainspring." Elias, who had indeed dreamt of a stubbornly faulty clock mechanism, stared. "You can tell that?" Silas inclined his head. "A minor observational skill. The subtle energetic signatures of human neural activity are quite distinct. A well-tuned instrument, if one knows how to read the fluctuations. Shall we avail ourselves of Agnes's culinary interpretations once more?" They descended to the common room, which was as usual shrouded in a thin veil of stale ale and simmering resentment. Agnes merely grunted as she served their thin porridge and lukewarm tea. Elias found a small, wobbly table near the hearth, the warmth a welcome reprieve from the persistent dampness that clung to everything. He stirred his porridge, the grey gruel swirling with a stubborn resistance that felt almost metaphorical. "Disturbance penhypnology, dansel, otidbolde hendisit, itzilos," Elias began, after a long silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of other patrons. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about your consultancy and your dietary preferences." Silas paused, his spoon hovering over his bowl. "Indeed, Mr. Thorne, I do hope my explanations were sufficiently clear. I pride myself on transparency, particularly with those with whom I share such intimate accommodations." "Clear, yes," Elias said, trying to choose his words carefully, "but also rather unsettling. You're a demon. Traditional demons, from the stories I've heard, they don't sip tea and discuss the nuances of despair like a vintner discusses wine. They're supposed to be about fire and brimstone and corruption. They're supposed to be evil, Unambiguously so. He met Silas's amber gaze across the table. What's the catch? Why are you so... Polite? A slow, almost imperceptible smile spread across Silas's lips. It was a smile that held ancient amusement, a vast, patient understanding of mortal preconceptions. Ah, Mr. Thorne, you touch upon a most fascinating misconception. The concept of evil, as mortals define it, is often rather simplistic, derived from a limited understanding of universal mechanics and, dare I say, a rather provincial worldview. What? My kind. We operate on principles far more sophisticated than mere good or evil. Those are moral constructs, useful for regulating human societies, but rather crude for beings operating on a cosmic scale. He placed his spoon down, entirely composed. As for fire and brimstone, that, I assure you, is largely a matter of branding. A marketing strategy employed by certain more theatrical elements of my lineage. It creates a striking impression, certainly, but it is, as I explained, dreadfully inefficient. Imagine the carbon footprint alone. No, my dear Mr. Thorne, true efficacy lies in subtlety, in the gentle, imperceptible erosion, not the dramatic incineration. But your goal is still to cause despair, Elias pressed, a prickle of unease returning despite Xylos's calm demeanor. To feed on it. How is that not evil? Consider it a form of existential clarification, Mr. Thorne. Silas replied, his eyes gleaming with a kind of intellectual relish. I merely facilitate a mortal's journey towards a more profound understanding of their own inherent limitations and the ultimate meaninglessness of their temporal pursuits. Is illuminating the truth, however bleak, inherently evil? I argue it is merely a matter of perspective. Many philosophers, even among your own kind, have grappled with such concepts. I simply provide a more direct experiential pathway. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though perfectly audible in the quiet common room. And as for politeness, that, I assure you, is not a catch. It is a fundamental principle of effective operation. Crude, boorish behavior is simply counterproductive. Imagine trying to subtly nudge a soul towards profound resignation. If one is constantly bellowing threats or manifesting in a cloud of noxious vapor, it ruptures the delicate trust required for such intimate work. Manas, Mr. Thorne, are the lubricant of effective interaction, even between species with fundamentally divergent objectives. They allow for a smooth transaction, a harmonious exchange. Exchange? Elias questioned. You're taking something from them, their despair, and I am providing them with a refined perspective, Silas countered smoothly, a deeper insight into the nature of their reality. Is that not a form of exchange? I refine their emotional output. They, in turn, provide me with sustenance. It is a symbiotic relationship, albeit one that is perhaps not immediately apparent to the uninitiated. A clean transaction, without the mess or the fuss of traditional demonic contracts, which always seem to involve far too much calligraphy and legalistic wrangling. My methods are far more organic. So, there's no price, no hidden clause, no eternal damnation waiting for me if I don't give you enough weariness or annoyance? Elias asked, a hint of genuine worry in his voice now. Silas gave a soft, amused chuckle. Mr. Thorne, you misunderstand the nuances of modern demonic engagement. The grand, overt damnation is largely a relic of a less sophisticated era. It's simply not scalable. Imagine the sheer administrative burden of managing billions of eternally damned souls. The logistics are staggering. My approach is far more sustainable, and frankly, more ethical. I merely consume the emanation of despair, not the soul itself. The soul, for all its potential for fascinating emotional output, is rather indigestible anyway. And as for a hidden clause, that would be a breach of trust, wouldn't it? And trust, however fleeting, is essential for any effective consultancy. He picked up his teacup, examining the faint cracks in its surface. My payment, as I explained, is in the cultivation and consumption of emotional resonance. You, Mr. Thorne, are a delightful source of low-level ambient frustration, particularly regarding your inability to locate mythical clock parts. It's a gentle hum, not a roaring bonfire. I assure you, you are perfectly safe. Your soul remains entirely your own, free to experience whatever fleeting joys or profound disappointments it encounters. I merely facilitate the latter, ever so subtly. Elias stared into his lukewarm tea. So, your politeness? It's just a professional courtesy. A tool for better harvesting. It is a multifaceted concept, Mr. Thorne Exilus explained, with the air of a scholar elucidating a complex theorem. Firstly, yes, it is indeed a professional courtesy. One cannot expect optimal output from a client if one treats them with disdain or crude aggression. A calm, respectful demeanor encourages a more natural, less inhibited production of emotional energy. Secondly, it is a matter of personal preference. I find crudity aesthetically unappealing. There is an elegance to restraint, a beauty in precision. And thirdly, it is simply more comfortable for both parties. Why engage in unnecessary conflict when a polite conversation can achieve the same, or indeed, superior results? He gestured around the dimly lit common room. Observe Agnes, for instance. Her resentment simmers perpetually, a delightful, consistent source of low-grade negative emotion. If I were to suddenly appear in a cloud of sulfur and demand, she hand over her last copper. She might, in her terror, cease to function entirely, thus terminating a valuable, if small, source of frustration. But by interacting with her politely, by simply requesting my mundane porridge and lukewarm tea, I allow her to continue her daily existence, subtly fueling her internal dissatisfaction without ever disrupting her capacity for future output. It is, you see, a long-term strategy. Elias rubbed his chin, a dazed look on his face. So, your ethics are simply about efficiency and sustainability for your business and personal preference, Mr. Thorne. Do not forget the personal preference, Silos corrected gently. I find a well-ordered environment, both physical and emotional, conducive to my own state of being. Chaos is draining. Conflict is tiresome. Manas, therefore, are not merely a social construct. They are a form of energy conservation. Why expend effort on screaming and destruction when a gentle, well-placed word can achieve a far more profound and lasting effect? A whispered doubt, for instance, can erode a soul more effectively than 1,000 fiery torments, and it requires significantly less vocal effort. He took another sip of his tea, his amber eyes seeming to sparkle with suppressed amusement. Besides, Mr. Thorne, there's a certain quiet satisfaction in confounding mortal expectations. They anticipate the monstrous, the grotesque, the overtly terrifying, to be presented instead with an entity of impeccable manners, who discusses existential dread with the dispassionate air of a seasoned academic, who worries about blanket distribution and snoring. It often leads to a far more profound bewilderment. And bewilderment, you see, is a wonderful precursor to disillusionment. It unravels the familiar fabric of reality, leaving one wonderfully receptive to new, unsettling truths. Elias sighed. a sound of profound resignation that Silos seemed to absorb with quiet satisfaction. He was sharing a bed with a demon who was polite not out of any inherent goodness, but out of a perverse, chillingly logical commitment to efficiency, professionalism, and personal aesthetic. His ethics were those of a fastidious, long-term harvester of souls, not a crude destroyer. The world was not less terrifying, but rather terrifying in a far more subtle, polite, and infinitely more unsettling way. "I see," Elias said finally, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "So, for the record, you're not going to try and corrupt me, or claim my soul in the night?" Silos smiled, a full, genuine smile that was somehow more unsettling than his previous quiet amusements. "Mr. Thorn, I do not believe in unsolicited corruption. It is, frankly, rather rude. And as for your soul, I have already explained, it is of limited dietary value to me, and frankly, I have no need of it. I am perfectly content with the subtle emotional emanations you so generously produce. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I detect a rather delightful wave of self-pity emanating from the gentleman by the fire. He seems to be contemplating the inevitable decline of his physical faculties. A truly classic vintage of despair. I shall simply observe, of course, from a respectable distance. Politeness, you see, is key." Elias watched, utterly dumbfounded, as Ixilos rose from the table with effortless grace and moved towards a corner of the common room, settling into a chair from which he could discreetly observe the unfortunate patron. He was a consultant in existential despair, and his ethical code was based on the efficiency of polite psychological erosion. Elias Thorn, the humble clock repairman, felt a strange, unsettling clarity wash over him. His search for a mere clock mechanism suddenly felt like the most ordinary, least perplexing pursuit in a world that had become impossibly, hilariously polite. He finished his tea, the lukewarm liquid now tasting faintly of ironic understanding. Chapter 7. The Demon's Unusual Hobby. The rain, a tireless companion, continued its methodical patter against the window of room 7, as Elias Thorn roused himself for another day in the slumbering sow. The scent of damp wood and forgotten meals, the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones of the inn. These were now as familiar as the ache in his knees. And across the narrow bed, Xelos was, predictably a study in elegant repose, a still, dark form beneath the thin blanket. Elias, in his waking moments, half expected to see a faint, melancholic aura around the demon, a testament to his unique diet, but the morning light remained too dim for such a subtle sight. He stretched, listening to the familiar groaning of the bedsprings, and carefully navigated his escape from the shared mattress, ensuring not to breach the meticulously established blanket boundary. As Elias pulled on his perpetually damp boots, their leather protesting with a mournful squeak, Xelos stirred. It was the same fluid, unhurried unfolding, those unsettlingly bright amber eyes opening without a flicker of human grogginess. "Good morning, Mr. Thorn," Xelos murmured, his voice as smooth and silken as ever. "I trust your nocturnal recuperation was sufficient? I noted a distinct lack of existential angst in your recent dream cycles. A rather commendable state, if I may say so. Perhaps a sign of adaptation to our peculiar circumstances." Elias merely grunted, running a hand through his unruly hair. "Adaptation, or just plain exhaustion, Xelos. The two often masquerade as one another." He tied his boots. Another day, another futile search for an elusive clock mechanism, and another bowl of Agnes's unique porridge, I presume. "Indeed," Xelos replied, rising with a dancer's grace. The consistency of daily disappointment can, I find, be quite stabilizing for the mortal psyche. It establishes a comforting predictability in an otherwise chaotic existence. Breakfast was, as anticipated, a culinary experience best described as functional, yet Ixylos approached his thin gruel with the same detached, appreciative air he might bestow upon a particularly nuanced piece of philosophical despair. Elias found his conversations with Ixylos increasingly punctuated by a dry amusement that bordered on the hysterical. The sheer, unfathomable absurdity of his situation, sharing a bed with a demon who critiqued porridge and analyzed dream statchad, become less terrifying and more curiously compelling. He spent his day pursuing the mythical clock mechanism in the surrounding hamlets, finding only closed shops, vague directions, and the unyielding drizzle. He returned to the slumbering sow as twilight deepened, his spirits flagging, his boots squelching, and his pockets decidedly empty. He pushed open the door to room 7, expecting the usual dim quiet, perhaps Silas meditating on a particularly robust wave of local disappointment. What he found instead, however, was entirely unexpected. Silas was seated on the edge of the bed, perfectly composed as always, but his long, slender fingers were engaged in a peculiar activity. In his hands were 2 impossibly thin, gleaming needles and a ball of yarn, a deep, muted gray that seemed to absorb the scant light in the room. His fingers moved with a rapid, precise rhythm, clicking softly, almost musically, as he worked. And in his lap, already taking shape, was something undeniably small, something that looked suspiciously like a tiny, unfinished garment. Elias blinked, then rubbed his eyes. He must be more tired than he thought. "Silas," he ventured, his voice a little hoarse. "What, pray tell, are you doing?" Silas looked up, his amber eyes acknowledging Elias' presence without missing a stitch. "Ah, Mr. Thorne, you return. I trust your day of questing for the elusive mechanism was suitably unrewarding. I sensed a subtle increment of resignation in your gait as you ascended the stairs. Quite commendable. That, a quiet acceptance of futility, is a cornerstone of refined despair." He gestured to his hands with one of the needles, which glinted briefly. "As for your query, I am simply engaged in a minor recreational pursuit, a hobby, as mortals call it. I am, you see, knitting." Elias felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, quickly suppressed. He swallowed it down, forcing it back into the depths of his being, where it mingled with the weariness and the ever-present existential dread. "Knitting," he managed, the words sounding entirely alien in the context of a demon. You knit?" "Indeed," Silas confirmed, his needles clicking rhythmically. "It is a remarkably soothing activity. The repetitive motion, the rhythmic precision, the gradual emergence of order from chaos. It is deeply contemplative, and quite efficacious for clearing the mind. One cannot, after all, focus on the intricate nuances of a mortal's unraveling sense of self if one's own internal processes are cluttered with extraneous noise. Knitting provides a delightful mental quietude." He held up the nascent garment for Elias's inspection. It was unmistakably a miniature sweater, rendered in the somber gray yarn, with impossibly tiny armholes. Elias stared. What is that for?" "It's awfully small." Silas tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Ah, yes. Its diminutive scale is quite intentional. This, Mr. Thorne, is a sweater. Specifically, it is intended for an imp like you. My, shall we say, more junior colleagues." Elias blinked again. "An impispil. A tiny imp. A tiny imp who needed a sweater." He found himself struggling to process this latest absurdity. Imps. You mean the small, mischievous, often fiery creatures. Precisely, Ixylos affirmed, resuming his knitting with renewed vigor. A common misconception, however, is that all imps are impervious to cold, while many of their kind thrive in more thermally active environments. There are numerous subspecies, particularly those assigned to duties in the more temperate or indeed frigid realms of the lower planes, who suffer quite dreadfully from the chill. Their natural epidermal integument is simply not designed for prolonged exposure to anything below, say, 200 degrees Celsius. So you knit them sweaters because they get cold? Elias asked, his voice a strained whisper. The laugh he was trying to suppress threatened to burst free. A matter of efficiency, Mr. Thorn, Xylos explained, his tone entirely serious. A cold imp is an unproductive imp. Shivering, chattering teeth, poor circulation, these are all hindrances to the meticulous execution of minor torments. One cannot adequately whisper insidious doubts into a mortal's ear if one is preoccupied with frostbite. A comfortable imp, however, is a focused imp, and a focused imp is a productive imp. Therefore, the provision of adequate thermal regulation for my subordinates is, you see, a professional necessity, and I find the process of creating these garments myself to be a far more aesthetically pleasing and personally satisfying endeavor than outsourcing the task to, say, a gnomish haberdashery whose quality control, I have found, leaves much to be desired. He held up the tiny sweater again, turning it carefully to inspect a stitch. This particular yarn, for instance, is spun from the refined essence of quietly endured disappointment. It possesses remarkable insulation properties and an agreeable, subtly somber hue, perfect for blending into shadows, which is often a practical requirement for impish duties. And the pattern is a simple garter stitch, chosen for its durability and ease of care. Imps, alas, are not always the most fastidious with their garments. Elias imagined an imp, a creature of legend and terror, carefully slipping into a miniature sweater knitted from the essence of disappointment. The image was so profoundly ridiculous, so utterly at odds with every preconceived notion of a demon, that Elias felt his internal composure begin to fray. He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying desperately to maintain a semblance of gravity. You choose the yarn based on what kind of despair it's from? Elias asked, the words barely making it past the lump in his throat. Naturally, Xylos replied, as if stating the most obvious fact in the universe. Different emotional essences possess different fibrous qualities. The despair of a jilted lover, for instance, yields a yarn that is prone to unraveling, quite unsuitable for practical garments. But the frustration of a meticulous artisan whose work is perpetually overlooked, that yields a remarkably resilient fiber with excellent tensile strength, perfect for sleeves that will endure the rigors of impish duty. This gray, as I mentioned, is from the quiet, pervasive disappointment of a mid-level bureaucrat who had just discovered his life's work would be filed under miscellaneous redundancies. It's remarkably soft, yet durable, a superb blend. Elias sunk onto the edge of his side of the bed, feeling utterly overwhelmed. He was being given a detailed lecture on the material properties of knitted despair yarn by a demon. The dry humor of the situation was so potent, so deeply ingrained in the very fabric of his current reality, that it was almost unbearable. He could feel a hysterical giggle trying to escape, battling against the polite solemnity of Xylos's pronouncements. And the imps appreciate these. Elias managed, picturing an imp complaining about a scratchy wool. Xylos paused his knitting, gazing into the middle distance. They do, in their own fashion. There was, admittedly, a period of adjustment. Some preferred the simpler, more traditional thermal solutions involving small self-generated bursts of internal flame. But I explained the long-term benefits of passive insulation, the reduced energy expenditure, and the general aesthetic appeal. Most have come to appreciate the superior comfort, though I have had a few complaints about certain unflattering necklines or a lack of seasonal variety. One cannot please everyone, even in the lower planes. He sighed, a soft, almost wistful sound. My current project is for an imp named Gribble. He is particularly sensitive to cold, prone to rather dramatic shivering fits which, while amusing for a brief period, can interfere with his ability to effectively manipulate the subtle anxieties of his assigned mortal. This sweater, I believe, will alleviate his discomfort and allow him to return to his duties with renewed efficiency. Elias could only shake his head slowly. The world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. He had expected demons to be monstrous, terrifying, but never had he imagined them to be so meticulously polite, so logically minded, and so utterly dedicated to the craft of knitting tiny sweaters for their subordinates. It was a level of mundane absurdity that surpassed all his previous encounters. "So," Elias said, finally letting a small disbelieving chuckle escape, a sound that Dexilos regarded with a mild, analytical interest. "Your unusual hobbies." Knitting thermals for chilly imps, using harvested despair as yarn. A rather succinct summary, Mr. Thorne. "And quite accurate," Xylos replied, his needles clicking with renewed purpose. "It provides a constructive outlet for creative energy, ensures the comfort and efficiency of my junior operatives, and offers a quiet, meditative respite from the rigors of existential consultancy. A truly multifaceted pursuit. Wouldn't you agree? And one that causes absolutely no distress to the mortal population beyond." Perhaps a brief moment of bewildered amusement for a certain traveling clock repairman. Elias lay back on his side of the bed, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. He watched the precise rhythmic movement of Xylos's hands, the soft clicking of the needles, the slow, steady growth of the tiny gray sweater. The rain continued its gentle patter outside, and from the other side of the bed, he could still feel the faint, polite thrum of Xylos's presence. He closed his eyes, a strange, almost peaceful smile on his face. He had come to the slumbering sow seeking a clock mechanism, and instead he had found a demon who knitted. And in the quiet, peculiar normalcy of it all, Elias Thorne finally drifted into a deep, surprisingly untroubled sleep, his dreams perhaps gently influenced by the soft clicking of tiny knitting needles. Chapter 8. A nocturnal philosophical debate. The persistent drizzle against the window of room 7 had long ceased to be a mere sound, and had transformed into a fundamental aspect of Elias Thorne's existence within the slumbering sow. It was the world's quiet hum, a background to the peculiar, unsettling normalcy of sharing a bed with a polite demon. Elias had drifted into a surprisingly peaceful sleep, the soft clicking of Xylos knitting needles still echoing faintly in his mind, a bizarre lullaby. Hours later, in the deepest part of the night, when the inn had settled into its most profound stillness, Elias found himself gently roused. It wasn't a sudden noise, nor a physical touch, but a subtle shift in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to originate from Xylos's side of the bed. It was not the usual low thrum, but a more agitated, though still quiet, presence. He opened his eyes, blinking into the profound darkness of the room, which felt thicker and more ancient in the dead of night. He could just make out Xylos, a dark, elongated silhouette on his side of the bed. The demon was, once again, sitting upright, facing away from Elias, but his posture seemed different. There was a subtle tension in the way his shoulders were held, A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air around him. No glowing orb of despair this time. No knitting needles. Just an intense stillness that was somehow more unsettling than any overt activity. Elias whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. He felt a familiar prickle of unease, though he had learned by now that overt terror was rarely the appropriate response to Xylos' peculiar manifestations. Xylos turned slowly, his amber eyes luminous in the darkness fixed on Elias. They seemed to hold an unusual depth tonight, a hint of something akin to preoccupation. "Ah, Mr. Thornhill, my sincerest apologies for disturbing your repose once more. I did endeavor to remain internally contained. However, certain philosophical quandaries, particularly those regarding the more nuanced aspects of causality and predetermined outcomes, have a tendency to become rather insistent in the quieter hours." Elias pushed himself up onto an elbow, pulling the blanket higher. Philosophical quandaries, at this hour. He rubbed his eyes. "Is this about the optimal stitch for an imp sweater?" Xylos offered a faint, almost rueful smile. "Alas, no, Dottie. While the tensile strength of despair yarn is indeed a fascinating subject, tonight my contemplations have drifted to matters of greater existential weight. Specifically, the persistent mortal obsession with free will and its supposed role in their ultimate damnation." He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of millennia. "It is a concept, I confess, that continues to perplex me, despite centuries of rigorous observation." Elias, his mind still adrift in the liminal space between sleep and wakefulness, found himself unexpectedly drawn into the conversation. "Perplexes you? But aren't demons supposed to, well, tempt people and then condemn them for their choices? If there's no free will, how does that work?" Xylos leaned forward slightly, his amber eyes glowing more intensely, reflecting the nascent intellectual fervor that always seemed to accompany his profound pronouncements. "Precisely, Mr. Thorne. You grasped the fundamental paradox. The traditional narrative, as propagated by both your religious institutions and my more theatrical brethren, suggests a dramatic struggle between individual choice and predetermined fate. The mortal, supposedly, stands at a crossroads, choosing between virtue and vice, and his eternal destiny hangs upon that choice. A compelling narrative, certainly. Emotionally resonant. But intellectually, it is rather messy." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts from the vast archives of demonic experience. "Consider the variables. The genetic predispositions, the environmental influences, the societal pressures, the subtle biological imperatives, and, of course, the occasional, precisely timed whisper from my kind. To what extent is any choice truly free when influenced by such a vast tapestry of pre-existing conditions? And if a choice is not truly free, can one truly be held accountable for its consequences? It's a rather inconvenient question for the architects of grand damnation. Wouldn't you agree?" Elias found himself nodding slowly, despite the chill and the ungodly hour. "So you're saying people don't really have free will? It's just an illusion. An exceedingly useful illusion, Mr. Thorne," Xylos corrected gently. "It provides a framework for moral judgment, a justification for punishment, and a convenient explanation for why things go awry. Without the concept of free will, mortal societies would, I imagine, descend into a chaotic morass of unaccountability. And that, frankly, would disrupt the subtle, slow cultivation of despair, which relies heavily on individuals believing they could have, and indeed, shoulding have, chosen otherwise. The regret, the self-recrimination, these are far more potent than the despair of mere helplessness." He shifted on the bed, his dark silhouette seeming to expand slightly in the gloom. My own methodology, as you know, bypasses this convoluted debate entirely. I do not concern myself with whether a choice is truly free. I merely identify the pre-existing vulnerabilities, the inherent tendencies towards frustration, the seeds of quiet dissatisfaction already present within a mortal's psyche. And then I provide a gentle, almost imperceptible nudge. It is not about forcing a choice, but about illuminating the path towards an inevitable outcome that was always, in essence, there. I merely expedite the process. A truly efficient consultant does not tamper with the fundamental mechanics of the universe. One simply optimizes the existing pathways. So, you're not damning anyone, Elias said slowly, trying to wrap his drowsy mind around the concept. You're just accelerating their disillusionment? Precisely. Think of it as intellectual midwifery, but for existential dread. And the damnation, such as it exists, is merely the logical conclusion of a life spent accumulating regrets and unfulfilled potential. I do not inflict it, I merely highlight its inevitable arrival. And then, of course, I sample its delicious emotional residue. It is, you see, a much more ethical approach than the crude, old-fashioned methods of torment and forced servitude. Those, frankly, are so terribly uncultured. A comfortable silence descended for a moment, punctuated by the rhythmic patter of the rain. Elias found the demon's logical, almost academic, explanation of damnation far more unsettling than any fire and brimstone sermon he had ever heard. It stripped away the comforting melodrama, leaving only a chillingly efficient, impersonal process. Speaking of ethical approaches, Mr. Thorne, Silas continued, his voice softening slightly, I have been meaning to inquire about a particularly curious mortal predilection. Your species' fascination with coffee? Elias blinked. The sudden shift in topic was jarring, yet somehow perfectly in keeping with Silas's character. Coffee? You mean the drink? Indeed. I have observed many mortals partaking of it, particularly in the morning. A rather pungent, bitter concoction. And yet, many seem to require it to initiate their daily functions. I confess, I find its inherent properties rather counterproductive for my purposes. Silas shuddered delicately. The immediate jolt of stimulated energy, the sudden rush of heightened alertness, it is quite antithetical to the slow, subtle cultivation of melancholy. One cannot effectively nudge a soul towards profound resignation if one is constantly buzzing with caffeinated agitation. It interferes with the delicate balance of introspection. You prefer tea, then? Elias ventured, recalling Silas's preference for the inn's lukewarm brew. Ah, tea, Silas murmured, a note of almost reverent satisfaction in his voice. Tea is a masterpiece of gentle stimulation. It encourages a contemplative state, a subtle awakening, without the jarring, almost violent arousal that coffee seems to induce. The nuanced bitterness, the gradual warmth, the faint, comforting aroma, it sets the mind at ease, allowing for a more subtle unraveling of one's inner anxieties. It is a beverage designed for quiet reflection, for the slow, methodical processing of existential dread. Coffee, by contrast, seems designed for frantic escape from it. He continued, as if lecturing an unseen audience. Consider the energetic signatures. Coffee emits a sharp, jagged energy, erratic and unpredictable. It creates a kind of defensive barrier around the human psyche, a frantic delusion of purpose that makes it difficult to introduce the subtle nuances of futility. Tea, however, cultivates a smoother, more porous energetic field. It invites introspection, encourages a gentle surrender to one's inner landscape. It allows me to gently sample the nascent tendrils of disappointment without having to contend with a sudden surge of misplaced optimism. So, you avoid coffee because it makes your work harder? Elias asked, a faint, weary amusement stirring within him. Precisely, Mr. Thorne. It is a matter of professional efficacy, combined with personal aesthetic preference. One cannot expect to execute a finely tuned erosion of hope if one's subject is jittering with an excess of simulated vitality. It's like attempting to repair a delicate timepiece with a sledgehammer. The tools must be appropriate for the task, and tea, gentle, contemplative tea, is the perfect companion for the methodical unraveling of purpose. Xylos paused, his amber eyes seeming to gaze into the darkness beyond the walls of the room. It is a curious thing, this mortal struggle for meaning. So much effort expended, so many grand designs, all to avoid the simple, quiet truth of impermanence. And yet, it is precisely that struggle, that constant Sisyphean effort, that generates the most exquisite despair. A delicate irony, wouldn't you agree? Elias lay back, sinking deeper into the lumpy mattress. The rain continued its steady, relentless patter. He was having a profound philosophical debate about free will, damnation, and the preferred stimulants of demons, all in the dead of night, in a narrow bed, with a being who found the taste of the void invigorating and knitted sweaters for imps from distilled human misery. The sheer glorious absurdity of it all began to lull him. The concepts, however, terrifying, were delivered with such dry wit, such detached academic interest, that they felt less like threats and more like peculiar bedtime lectures. I think, Elias mumbled, his voice thick with encroaching sleep. I prefer my despair, unclarified by demonic consultants, and my coffee, not analyzed for its impact on existential dread. Xylos chuckled, a soft, purring sound that vibrated gently through the mattress. As you wish, Mr. Thorne. To each their own methodology for navigating the inherent meaninglessness of existence. I shall continue with my refined observations, and perhaps contemplate the optimal moisture content for a particularly resilient form of bureaucratic frustration. It promises to yield an excellent yarn for trousers. The room settled back into its quietude, broken only by the rain. Elias felt sleep pulling him under a heavy, welcome blanket. From the other side of the bed he felt Xylos shift. Then a quiet stillness. He imagined a demon, perfectly composed, perhaps contemplating the properties of various forms of emotional residue, or perhaps simply enjoying the quiet ambience. The night, though filled with peculiar revelations, was, by all accounts, surprisingly restful. And Elias Thorne, the weary traveler, found himself drifting to sleep with the comforting thought that at least his demon bedfellow was a tea drinker. Chapter 9. The demon's curious cold feet. The perpetual drizzle. A steady companion to Elias Thorne's stay at the slumbering sow, continued its monotonous performance against the rattling window. Elias stirred, the lumpy mattress offering its usual reluctant embrace, and stretched his weary limbs. The air in room 7, thin and carrying the persistent scent of damp plaster and aged dust, felt colder than usual this morning, a raw chill that seemed to penetrate the very bones. He glanced across the narrow expanse of the shared bed. Xylos was, as always, an impeccable silhouette, utterly still beneath the thin blanket, his presence a quiet, almost domestic hum. Elias, despite himself, found a peculiar comfort in the demon's predictable stillness, a strange anchor in a world that had become increasingly topsy-turvy since his arrival. He was no longer terrified, merely profoundly, hilariously bewildered. As Elias began his routine of extracting himself from the bed, his feet finding the cold, uneven floorboards, he noticed a subtle yet distinct coolness emanating from Ixylos's side of the mattress. It was not merely the ambient chill of the room, but something more concentrated. A localized pocket of lower temperature. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the draft from the ill-fitting window, or perhaps some peculiar energetic byproduct of Xylos's nocturnal meditations on bureaucratic frustration. Yet, as he continued to dress, pulling on his coarse wool trousers, the unusual cold lingered, an almost imperceptible undercurrent, beneath the usual dampness of the inn. Xylos stirred, unfolding with his characteristic fluid grace. His amber eyes, impossibly bright in the dim morning light, opened and fixed upon Elias. "Good morning, Mr. Thorn," Xylos murmured, his voice a smooth, silken thread in the quiet room. "I trust your slumber was free from any excessive philosophical rumination on the nature of predestination. I found my own nocturnal contemplations to be unusually bracing last night. One often forgets the more pedestrian aspects of elemental interaction when immersed in the abstract." Elias grunted, running a hand through his perpetually unruly hair. "Bracing is one word for it, Xylos. My feet feel like they've been left out overnight to cure." He pulled on one of his thick, worn socks, the wool providing a small, immediate comfort. As Xylos swung his long, slender legs over the side of the bed, preparing to rise, Elias's gaze fell to the demon's feet. They were long and elegantly formed, tipped with the impossibly well manicured dark talons he had observed before. But what struck Elias was not their unusual anatomy, but their apparent temperature. A faint, almost visible wisp of chill seemed to hover around them, subtly radiating outward. They looked to Elias's human eyes almost unnaturally pale, with a faint, bluish tinge that hinted at profound cold. Xylos stood, moving towards the chipped basin in the corner to perform his morning ablutions. His movements were as graceful as ever, yet Elias couldn't shake the impression of a subtle rigidity in his ankles, as if the cold had seeped into the very bone. When Xylos dipped his long, slender fingers into the frigid water of the basin, there was no outward reaction from the demon, no shudder or gasp. He simply proceeded with his meticulous washing, as if the water were perfectly temperate. But Elias, watching closely, noted the way the fine hairs on his own arms prickled in response to the localized chill radiating from the demon's feet. Even from across the room, the absurdity of the situation struck Elias with renewed force. Here was a being who consumed despair, knitted sweaters for imps from distilled melancholy, and debated free will with the dispassionate logic of a scholar. And yet, he seemed to possess remarkably, undeniably, cold feet. Golds. As Xylos returned to the bedside, now impeccably dressed in his simple dark tunic and trousers, Elias hesitated. Was it impolite to comment on a demon's apparent physiological discomfort? Was it an insult to offer a mundane solution to a creature of cosmic power? He weighed the options in his mind. On one hand, it was a demon. On the other, it was his roommate. And politeness, as Xylos himself had preached, was paramount. And besides, there was a certain peculiar satisfaction in extending a human kindness to an entity so far beyond human comprehension. It was a small act of defiance against the overwhelming strangeness. Elias began, his voice surprisingly firm. "Forgive me for saying, but your feet seem rather cold." Xylos paused, his amber eyes narrowing slightly, as if processing an unexpected piece of data. He glanced down at his elegant, pale feet, then back at Elias. "Cold?" he repeated, the word articulated with a peculiar mixture of inquiry and faint confusion. Then, yes, I suppose they might be, from a mortal perspective, my internal thermal regulation systems, while generally quite robust, to operate on a slightly different baseline. My extremities, particularly in environments such as this, which possess a rather persistent, pervasive damp chill, can sometimes deviate from the optimal operational temperature. It is a minor inconvenience, nothing more. A regrettable consequence of interfacing with suboptimal atmospheric conditions. He shrugged, a subtle ripple through his lean frame. It does not, however, impede my ability to formulate complex philosophical inquiries or to accurately assess the fluctuating levels of despair in the common room. Merely a subjective sensation, Mr. Thorne. A data point. Elias, despite the rationalization, felt a surge of peculiar empathy. Well, a data point that can be quite uncomfortable, I assure you. I have a spare pair of socks in my bag. Clean ones. They're wool. They might help, but gosh. He gestured towards his battered traveling bag, which contained his few remaining possessions. Xylos stared at Elias, his amber eyes unblinking. The usual intellectual amusement in his gaze was replaced by something Elias could only describe as bewilderment. Profound analytical bewilderment. Socks, Xylos murmured, the word tasting alien on his tongue. For my feet, you would offer me a garment for my extremities. An unsolicited act of thermal augmentation? Elias felt a faint blush creep up his neck. Yes, it's a common human solution for cold feet. They provide warmth. A moment of profound silence stretched between them, heavier than usual. Xylos's gaze, usually so sharp and knowing, seemed to lose its customary focus, drifting slightly, as if he were running complex computations through an ancient, unfamiliar processor. Elias wondered if he had overstepped, if he had somehow violated some arcane demonic etiquette by offering footwear. Perhaps demons considered socks an affront to their natural demonic state. Then, slowly, Xylos inclined his head, a gesture that seemed to carry an unusual weight of consideration. Mr. Benandensik, Adesokiti, Andalien. Thorne, he said, his voice softer than Elias had ever heard it, tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible note of wonder. That is an entirely unexpected proposition, a gesture of unsolicited compassion. I confess, it is a variable I had not accounted for in my models of mortal interaction. The pure, unadulterated intent to alleviate a minor physical discomfort, without any discernible motive beyond simple kindness. It is, dare I say, quite intriguing. He took a slow step closer to Elias, his head tilted, his amber eyes studying him with an intensity that felt both analytical and, strangely, almost tender. I have, of course, observed mortals offering such articles of clothing to one another for various reasons: warmth, status, a subtle display of affection, or perhaps an attempt to curry favor. But for a transient acquaintance, in such a context, it is for me a truly novel experience. I have not, in all my centuries of observation, been offered a pair of socks purely out of a concern for my corporeal comfort. Elias, feeling increasingly awkward, fumbled in his bag, pulling out a pair of thick, gray wool socks. They were clean, though well-worn, and still carried the faint scent of dried herbs he used to store his clothes. He extended them to Xylos. Here, they're good wool. Keep the cold out. Xylos took the socks, his long, slender fingers tipped with their dark talons, handling the mundane wool with a surprising delicacy, as if they were made of spun moonbeams. He held them up, turning them, his amber eyes scrutinizing the weave, the texture, the very essence of the garment. The fibers, he murmured, almost to himself. They seemed to possess a subtle, energetic resonance, a low-frequency vibration of domesticity, and a faint scent of dried lavender, perhaps. Quite unexpected. I had always assumed such materials were merely inert. He then sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, almost reverently, slipping one sock onto his pale, elegant foot. Elias watched, mesmerized, as the demon pulled the wool over his skin, his movements precise and unhurried. There was a faint, almost inaudible sigh, a sound that conveyed not relief but a kind of profound, analytical satisfaction. "Remarkable," Silos whispered, stretching his toes within the confines of the wool. "The sensation is novel, a pervasive, gentle warmth. It permeates the superficial epidermal layers and seems to resonate with the deeper skeletal structures. A most unexpected and rather pleasant thermal envelopment. The efficiency of such a simple construct is truly commendable. It provides a significant degree of comfort for a minimal investment of material and effort. A fascinating example of applied ingenuity." He then proceeded to put on the second sock, his movements just as deliberate, his amber eyes still alight with a kind of quiet, intellectual wonder. Once both feet were encased in the simple wool, he flexed them, as if testing the new sensation. "Mr. Thorne," Silos said, looking up, his gaze holding a new, profound depth, "I find myself grateful. This sensation of warmth is not one I am accustomed to experiencing in this particular form, nor is the act of receiving such an unprompted, benevolent gesture. It provides a fascinating new data point in my ongoing study of mortal motivations. I shall have to incorporate unsolicited sock provision into my future analyses of human behavior. It complicates the prevailing theories of inherent self-interest. A delightful anomaly. Indeed." Elias could only nod, a faint, almost bewildered smile touching his lips. He had just given socks to a demon, and the demon was genuinely, analytically grateful, saying it as a new variable in his study of human folly. The absurdity of it was so pervasive that it had almost become comforting. They descended to the common room for breakfast, the usual grey porridge and lukewarm tea awaiting them. As Silos meticulously stirred his gruel, Elias noticed that he seemed to hold himself with a subtly different posture, a faint relaxation in his shoulders. And from beneath the table, Elias could occasionally catch a glimpse of the thick, grey wool socks peeking out from beneath Silos's trousers. The demon, who dealt in the subtle erosion of souls and knitted from despair, now had warm feet. And in the quiet, peculiar normalcy of the slumbering sow, Elias Thorne felt a strange, almost gentle sense of understanding settle over him. The world was indeed mad, but perhaps, just perhaps, even its most terrifying inhabitants sometimes simply needed a good pair of socks. The rain continued its steady patter, a mundane backdrop to the truly extraordinary and surprisingly polite details of his new life. Chapter 10. The midnight disturbance. The rain had, for once, ceased its incessant drumming against the rattling window of room 7. A profound quiet had settled over the slumbering sow, deeper and more resonant than usual, perhaps because Elias Thorne had finally succumbed to a truly exhausted sleep, lulled by the peculiar rhythm of his new strange life. His dreams were mercifully devoid of intricate clockwork or existential despair, instead consisting of a rather mundane sequence of warm, dry socks. Beside him, Silos was, as always, an oasis of perfect stillness, his presence a near silent hum in the darkness, a comforting, if entirely unsettling, anchor. It was in this deep, dreamless state that Elias was rudely awakened, not by a subtle shift or a whispered philosophical query, but by a sudden, jarring cacophony that erupted from the common room below. A mighty crash, as if a particularly large and unwieldy piece of furniture had decided to spontaneously disassemble itself, was followed by a chorus of boisterous shouts, deep, bellowing laughter, and the distinct, clanging resonance of ill-maintained armor. The very foundations of the old inn seemed to shudder under the assault, protesting with a symphony of creaks and groans that sounded like the death throes of a giant, arthritic beast. Elias' eyes shot open, blinking into the oppressive darkness, his heart immediately thumping a frantic tattoo against his ribs. "By all that is holy," he muttered, pulling himself upright. "What in the name of—" From the other side of the bed, Silas, already perfectly upright and composed, spoke, his voice a low, analytical murmur that cut through the escalating chaos from downstairs. "Ah, Mr. Thorne. It appears our period of optimal nocturnal tranquility has been abruptly curtailed. I detect the distinct energetic signature of multiple highly agitated, ethanol-imbued human males. The resonating clatter suggests military-grade external plating, indicative of, perhaps, a detachment of knights. Their vocalizations indicate a profound disregard for the delicate sensibilities of fellow lodgers, and their general spatial disregard suggests a lack of training in quiet ingress." Another crash echoed from below, followed by a particularly robust burst of drunken singing, horribly off-key. Elias winced. "Knights? At this hour? What in the blazes are they doing, engaging in a primitive form of celebratory social bonding?" "I deduce," Silas replied, his tone one of mild intellectual annoyance rather than alarm, "and quite possibly searching for lodging, which, given the limited capacity of this establishment, will undoubtedly lead them to our present location. Their lack of preemptive inquiry at the counter suggests a rather authoritarian approach to accommodations. A regrettable, though entirely predictable, display of human self-importance, as if on cue." Heavy footsteps began to thunder up the creaking staircase, each thudding ascent a harbinger of imminent disruption. The raucous laughter grew louder, closer, punctuated by slurred commands and the occasional metallic clang of a dropped gauntlet. Elias felt a surge of genuine panic. A polite demon was one thing, an unexpected source of dry wit and philosophical insight, but a group of rowdy, possibly drunken knights stumbling into a dark, shared room and discovering Elias Thorne tucked into a single bed with a creature that possessed amber, slitted eyes and subtle horns. That was an entirely different and far more immediately perilous proposition. He imagined the accusations, the drawn swords, the utter lack of understanding. He would be lucky to escape with his life, let alone his reputation. Elias hissed, scrambling desperately to sit up. "They're coming here. What do? We can't be found like this." His mind raced, searching for an escape, a hiding place, anything. The room was small, sparse. There was nowhere to go. Silas, however, remained perfectly calm. "Indeed, Mr. Thorne. Panic, however, is statistically unproductive. It merely elevates one's heart rate and diminishes one's cognitive faculties. Observe." With an unnerving swiftness, Silas drew the thin blanket higher, pulling it up to his chin. His body, usually so rigidly composed, seemed to subtly shift, to soften, to blend more seamlessly into the shadows. He tilted his head slightly, and Elias, even in the dimness, perceived a faint, almost imperceptible shimmering around Silas's head, a blurring of outlines that seemed to subtly obscure the more prominent demonic features, the horns, the unnatural glow of his eyes. It was an illusion, Elias realized, subtle but effective. designed to make him appear more conventionally human, more innocuous. "We shall, Mr. Thorn," Silos whispered, his voice now imbued with a peculiar sleepy quality, "endeavor to appear as a perfectly ordinary pair of bedfellows, two weary travelers, sharing an inconveniently small inn bed, disturbed by the unfortunate boisterousness of their fellow guests. Simplicity is often the most effective form of deception. I shall assume the role of the gently slumbering companion. You, Mr. Thorn, shall provide the appropriate, albeit mild, human irritation at being so rudely awakened. Maintain a coherent, if sleepy, demeanor. Avoid dramatic gestures. And absolutely no screaming. That would be entirely uncivilized." The heavy footsteps paused directly outside their door. A loud, meaty hand slammed against the wood, making the entire frame rattle. "Oh, Innkeeper, are there any more beds in this blasted establishment? We've ridden hard, and my men are in need of rest and a final draught of ale." A deep, booming voice, laced with the unmistakable slur of an overindulged patron. Elias instinctively pulled the blanket tighter, shrinking as far as possible into his corner of the narrow bed. He could hear Agnes's weary, resigned voice from downstairs, faint but audible. "Room 7, Sir Knight. Only one left, but it's occupied by two quiet gentlemen." "Two quiet gentlemen, you say?" The voice boomed, followed by a derisive snort. "We shall see about that. One always suspects what goes on in the quiet rooms of an inn." There was a rough fumbling at the door, the sound of the iron key turning. Then the heavy oak door to room 7 burst inward with a splintering crash against the wall. Three figures, massive in their polished, dented armor, stumbled into the small room, casting long, distorted shadows that danced wildly in the faint light filtering from the hallway. One held a sputtering lantern aloft, its weak glow illuminating the cramped space. Their faces, framed by iron helmets pushed back on their heads, were florid with drink, their eyes bleary but surprisingly sharp as they swept across the room. "Well, well, what have we here?" The lead knight, a burly man with a thick, bushy beard, grunted, his gaze fixing on the single, occupied bed. His eyes narrowed, trying to penetrate the dimness. "Two men in one bed? And quiet, you say? Elias, heart-pounding, forced himself to respond. He squinted, feigning sleepiness, and pulled the blanket further up. "What in the blazes do you want?" he grumbled, his voice rough with feigned irritation and genuine fear. "Some of us are trying to sleep. Sir Knight, there's clearly no room here." He tried to make his voice sound as ordinary, as exasperatedly human as possible. He glanced quickly at Silos, whose form remained subtly blurred, his amber eyes now mere pinpricks of light in the shadow of his face, radiating an intense, quiet sleepiness that bordered on unnatural. The gray wool socks were still on his feet, barely visible beneath the blanket. The knight stepped closer, his heavy boots thudding on the uneven floorboards, the scent of stale ale and sweat filling the small room. He leaned over the bed, his shadow engulfing them both. "And who is your companion, fellow? Is he as eager for his rest as you?" Silos shifted subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. His voice, when it came, was a soft, exquisitely polite murmur, perfectly pitched to sound like a man roused reluctantly from a deep slumber. "Indeed, Sir Knight. My apologies for the lack of immediate articulation. One finds the sudden ingress of unannounced visitors rather jarring to the somnolent state. My name is Ixilos. My companion and I are merely unfortunate victims of a rather overbooked inn. We seek only the quietude necessary for restorative slumber." Perhaps you would be so kind as to close the door. The draught, you see, is rather inconvenient. Elias nearly choked on his feigned indignation. Silos, the demon, was asking a drunken, potentially dangerous knight to close the door for their comfort. The sheer audacity, delivered with such perfect, sleepy politeness, was breathtaking. The knight blinked, taken aback by the demon's unexpected civility. He clearly hadn't anticipated such a well-spoken, if slightly ethereal, response from a common inn lodger. He squinted at Silos, trying to discern his features in the dim, shifting light. Silos, with his subtle blurring and his perfectly modulated voice, seemed to appear utterly unremarkable to the knight's liquor-addled senses, just another slightly odd pale man trying to sleep. Well, now, listen here, friend, the knight grumbled, clearly disarmed by Xelos's composure. We're just looking for a place to lay our heads. No need for such formality. Is there truly no space for even one more amongst your cozy arrangement? He gestured vaguely at the narrow bed. Alas, Sir Knight, Xelos replied, his voice still a soft, almost mournful whisper. I assure you, the physical dimensions of this mattress are such that any additional occupancy would constitute a severe violation of established personal space parameters, leading to inevitable discomfort for all parties concerned. And discomfort, I find, is highly detrimental to the cultivation of restful repose. My companion, Mr. Thorn, is particularly sensitive to such special infringements. A rather restless sleeper, you see. When encroached upon, one would not wish to disturb his particular slumbering habits. Elias, still clinging to his role, gave a grunt of agreement, shifting subtly to reinforce Ulysses' description of his restless nature. The implication, he realized, was that Elias himself was the more problematic bedfellow, the one the knights really wouldn't want to share with. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt. The knight, clearly losing patience with the polite, if eccentric bedfellows, swore under his breath. He turned to his equally inebriated companions. Right then, lads. Looks like we're sleeping in the common room. These two clearly value their space. Come on. Let's see if Agnes has any more of that strong ale, with another series of thuds and clangs. The knights stumbled out of the room, leaving the door hanging precariously open, casting a rectangle of faint hallway light into the darkness. Their raucous laughter and singing slowly receded down the stairs, eventually fading into the general clamor of the common room below. Elias released a long, shuddering breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat up fully, rubbing his face with both hands. Gods above, Ixulust. That was too close. He looked over at the demon, whose form was now slowly returning to its usual crisp definition, the shimmering distortion fading, his amber eyes regaining their customary, unsettling brilliance. What did you do? Silos, still perfectly composed, merely adjusted the blanket, ensuring his half-width of coverage was meticulously preserved. A minor atmospheric manipulation. Mr. Thorn, a subtle projection of mundane energy, and a carefully modulated vocal inflection. Humans, particularly those whose higher cognitive functions are dulled by excessive ethanol consumption, are remarkably susceptible to such subtle influences. One merely presents them with a reality that is sufficiently dull and inconvenient to warrant a prompt departure. A tedious, but entirely necessary, intervention to preserve our shared nocturnal tranquility. He sighed, a soft sound that held a hint of exasperation. The cacophony, however, remains. One cannot entirely dampen the sound of a dozen drunken knights celebrating their latest, undoubtedly dubious, triumph. A most uncivilized disruption, I dare say. My internal analytical processes are entirely out of alignment. My philosophical contemplation of free will, for instance, has been entirely fragmented. And I detect a surge of rather aggressive, yet poorly structured, frustration emanating from the common room. Not a particularly useful vintage, I might add. Too much raw, untamed energy. Lacks finesse. Elias sank back onto the pillow, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. He could still hear the distant shouting and clanking from downstairs, a muted but persistent echo of the disturbance. He was sharing a bed with a demon who had just politely, subtly, and with remarkable precision managed to deter a group of rowdy knights, all for the sake of a quiet night's sleep. And the demon was now complaining about the quality of the despair emanating from downstairs. "You were quite good, you know," Elias mumbled, a strange, weary admiration in his voice. The gently slumbering companion act, very convincing. Xylos turned his head slightly, his amber eyes fixed on Elias in the darkness. "One endeavors for authenticity, Mr. Thorne, even in deception. It provides a greater return on the energetic investment. Though I must confess, the performance of sleepy human is rather more draining than one might anticipate. The constant suppression of one's natural emanations, the meticulous modulation of one's inherent presence, quite the effort. It interferes with the natural flow of thought." He paused, a faint, analytical hum beginning to emanate from his side of the bed. Still, it was preferable to the alternatives. A physical confrontation would have been entirely undignified, and the subsequent paperwork involved in explaining a spontaneously combusted knight to Agnes would have been simply intolerable. No, politeness, even under duress, is always the most efficient path. Though I confess, I shall have to revise my long-term models of human behavior to include a variable for abrupt, ethanol-fueled intrusions. It complicates the projections for sustained, low-level despair, cultivation, a minor setback, but one that can be accounted for. Elias closed his eyes, listening to the demon's soft, analytical hum and the distant, fading sounds of the celebrating nights. The night, though disturbed, had maintained its strange, peculiar normalcy. He was safe, for now. And the world, it seemed, was not merely mad, but also possessed of an astonishingly polite, strategically minded demon who preferred a quiet night's sleep to any form of chaotic drama, even when faced with boisterous nights. And Elias Thorne, the weary traveler, found himself, against all odds, drifting back to sleep, a faint, almost hysterical chuckle bubbling up from the depths of his thoroughly bewildered soul. The absurdity of it all was, in its own way, profoundly comforting. Chapter 11. The Demon's Protective Instincts. The slumbering sow still thrummed with the low, unpleasant resonance of the night's presence, though the initial explosion of drunken boisterousness had somewhat receded after Xylos's subtle, sleepy deterrence. A persistent undertone of rowdy revelry continued to seep up from the common room below, rattling the very floorboards of room 7. Elias Thorne had managed to drift back into a fitful sleep, punctuated by distant bellows and the occasional clang of what sounded suspiciously like a misplaced gauntlet. He woke, as was now his custom, to the thin, gray light of morning battling with the perpetual gloom outside, and the familiar, unnerving stillness of Xylos on the other side of the narrow bed. The air, thick with a lingering scent of stale ale and something indefinably metallic from the armored visitors, felt heavier than usual. Elias stretched, his muscles protesting with a symphony of aches. He glanced at Xylos, who, in his usual fashion, seemed to simply coalesce from the shadows, rather than truly awaken. Those amber eyes, with their unsettling vertical pupils, opened and fixed on Elias. "Good morning, Mr. Thorn," Silos murmured, his voice as smooth and silken as ever, though Elias detected a faint, almost imperceptible edge of annoyance in its perfectly modulated tone. "I regret to inform you that the ambient auditory pollution from below has remained at a rather suboptimal level throughout the nocturnal period. My internal analytical processes have been significantly impeded. It appears our boisterous guests have opted for a prolonged period of communal dissatisfaction. A rather unrefined method of social interaction, wouldn't you agree?" Elias grunted, pulling on his damp trousers. "They're still down there? I was hoping they'd have ridden out at dawn. Drunken knights are usually an early morning nuisance, not an all-night fixture." He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The memory of the previous night's intrusion, the burly knight peering into their shared bed, still pricked at him. What if they decide to come back up? Silos inclined his head, a gesture of elegant understanding. "A valid concern, Mr. Thorn. While my initial intervention was sufficient to redirect their immediate spatial ambitions, the lingering energetic signature of their collective belligerence suggests a potential for renewed scrutiny. Unrefined human minds, particularly when influenced by potent fermented grain, can be prone to irrational curiosity. However, I assure you, I have prepared for such contingencies. My protocols for managing undesirable human interactions are quite comprehensive." He paused, swinging his long, slender legs over the side of the bed. The thick gray wool socks Elias had given him now a curious, mundane counterpoint to his otherworldly presence. "Shall we brave the common room, then? I believe Agnes is preparing what she euphemistically refers to as breakfast." Descending the creaking stairs, Elias felt a prickle of nervous anticipation. The sounds from the common room grew louder as they approached, a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a tankard and a coarse laugh. The air was thick with the mingled scents of stale ale, wood smoke, and a faint, acrid tang of unwashed bodies. As they stepped into the common room, the noise seemed to amplify. Several knights, still clad in their dented armor, were huddled around the sputtering hearth, their faces ruddy and unshaven, their expressions a mixture of weary dissipation and lingering irritation. The burly lead knight from the previous night, his beard looking even more disheveled, sat slumped at a table nursing a tankard, his eyes bleary and bloodshot, fixed on Elias and Ixylos the moment they entered. "Well, look who decided to grace us with their presence," the knight rumbled, his voice thick with a morning-after rasp that did little to diminish its underlying aggression. His gaze lingered on Ixylos, a flicker of suspicion in his dull eyes. "The two quiet gentlemen, eh? Seems you had a rather restful night, considering the state of the rest of us." His companions, roused by his comment, turned to stare, their expressions mirroring his wary curiosity. Elias felt his heart thump. He opened his mouth, unsure what to say, but Ixylos stepped forward with an almost imperceptible grace, his posture one of polite deference. "Good morning, Sir Knight," Ixylos said, his voice as smooth as ever, yet carrying an unexpected clarity that seemed to cut through the common room's lingering fog of drunkenness. "We trust your own nocturnal experience was similarly restorative. Despite the unfortunate necessities of communal lodging, one finds that a quiet disposition, even amidst boisterous company, can often yield a superior quality of repose." As Ixylos spoke, Elias noticed a peculiar ripple in the air around the knight. It was barely perceptible, a subtle shimmer like heat haze rising from a distant road. The knight blinked, his eyes suddenly unfocusing for a split second, then refocusing with a strained effort. He lifted his tankard to his lips, took a long draught, then sputtered, "Blast and bother! This ale tastes like a goblin's bathwater." "What's wrong with it, Agnes?" he bellowed. slamming the tankard down. Agnes, wiping the counter with her usual air of simmering resentment, merely grunted. "Same as always, Sir Knight. Perhaps your palate is simply sensitive this morning." Xylos inclined his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. Indeed, the subjective experience of taste, particularly after a period of prolonged indulgence, can be quite variable. One often finds that the lingering energetic residue of certain fermented beverages can interfere with the finer sensibilities of the gustatory receptors. It is a fascinating physiological phenomenon. As Xylos spoke, Elias noticed the other knights, who had been listening intently, seemed to visibly deflate. One, who had been about to take a bite of a stale bread roll, suddenly looked at it with an expression of profound disinterest, as if it had transformed into a particularly unappetizing rock. Another, who had been about to launch into a boisterous anecdote, simply trailed off, a vague look of confusion settling on his face. Their collective boisterousness seemed to be dissolving, replaced by a subtle, creeping ennui. The lead knight, still frowning at his tankard, squinted at Xylos. "You speak rather oddly, friend. And your eyes." He leaned closer, trying to peer into Xylos's amber gaze. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. This was it, the revelation. But as the knight's eyes met Xylos's, something strange happened. The knight blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing as if struggling to comprehend something just beyond his grasp. His gaze seemed to slide, to blur, passing over Xylos's features without truly registering them. The subtle, almost invisible horns, the elongated pupils, even the unnatural paleness of his skin seemed to flicker, to become indistinct, dissolving into the generic lines of a perfectly ordinary, if somewhat unsettlingly calm, face. It was as if his mind simply refused to process the unusual details. "My eyes?" Xylos murmured, his voice maintaining its perfectly polite, almost soothing cadence. "I assure you, Sir Knight, they are merely my own. Perhaps the lingering effects of the inn's rather atmospheric lighting. It can play tricks on the perception, particularly for those accustomed to the clear, crisp light of the open road." He paused, then continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming almost conspiratorial. "I find, however, that a strong sense of purpose, even a manufactured one, can often provide a useful bulwark against such environmental ambiguities. Perhaps your current quest is not quite as compelling as you had initially hoped. A common source of low-grade disillusionment, I assure you." As Xylos spoke these seemingly innocuous words, Elias watched in silent awe. The knight's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. His face, instead of growing angry, simply sagged into an expression of vague, indefinable weariness. The spark of suspicion in his eyes seemed to dim, replaced by a dull, introspective haze. He stopped trying to scrutinize Xylos, his gaze drifting to the lukewarm porridge Agnes had just placed before him. He poked at it with his spoon, a profound sense of futility seeming to emanate from him. "Aye," the knight mumbled, almost to himself. "The road's long, and the rewards, well, they're not always what one imagines, are they? These border skirmishes, endless, and the pay is never quite enough to truly mend the breaches in one's armor, let alone one's spirit." He sighed, a sound of profound resignation that Xylos seemed to absorb with a quiet, almost imperceptible hum of satisfaction. Elias realized with a chilling clarity what Xylos was doing. He wasn't just deflecting their suspicion, he was subtly, precisely, and without breaking his polite facade, guiding them towards a mild, generalized existential crisis. The knight's aggression and boisterousness were being gently drained, replaced by a pervasive sense of world weariness and the quiet futility of their lives. Their wine now tasted flat, their food unappetizing, their very purpose becoming vague and unfulfilling. It was a masterpiece of subtle, psychological warfare. One of the other knights, who had been about to challenge Elias directly, suddenly rubbed his temples. My head, it feels strangely heavy, and I feel inexplicably bored with the thought of another journey. Perhaps I should simply retire from this endless pursuit of fleeting glory and take up sheep farming. It seems more honest somehow, more immediate. He stared blankly at his plate. The urge for confrontation entirely evaporated. A most practical consideration. Silos murmured, his voice a soft, almost hypnotic whisper that seemed to permeate the common room, affecting everyone within earshot. The immediate gratification of tangible achievement, even in the most humble of endeavors, often outweighs the elusive promise of abstract glory. The cyclical nature of the harvest, the simple warmth of an unchallenging routine, it can be quite soothing to the restless soul. Agnes, who had been silently observing the strange shift in the knight's demeanor, merely grunted, a sound that, for the first time, Elias interpreted as something akin to bewildered approval. She had clearly seen Ixylos's effects on others before, but perhaps never so overtly, yet subtly applied. The knights, now thoroughly subdued and oddly contemplative, continued to pick at their unappetizing breakfast, their earlier boisterousness replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic introspection. The lead knight, his head propped in his hand, merely sighed. Aye, perhaps a quiet life is what's truly needed. All this fighting, for what? A few more scars. Another empty purse? The existential cost is simply too high. Elias, who had merely watched in silent, profound awe, felt a wave of relief wash over him. The immediate danger had passed, not with a clash of steel, but with a quiet, polite erosion of morale. He glanced at Silos, whose amber eyes met his. There was no triumph in their depths, only a calm, analytical satisfaction. The demon had shielded him, not with a protective barrier of fire, but with a carefully crafted, politely delivered wave of mundane despair. Shall we take our breakfast to a quieter corner, Mr. Thorn? Silos suggested, his voice as composed as if he had merely been discussing the weather. I detect a lingering undercurrent of unproductive resignation here, which, while fascinating, is not particularly conducive to a productive morning meal. And besides, I find the collective sighs of philosophical weariness, while delightful in small doses, can be rather filling. Elias nodded, grabbing his bowl and following Silos to a secluded table by the window, far from the now muttering, profoundly disheartened knights. As he sat, he risked a glance back at the slumped, despondent figures. They were still there, but their earlier aggression had been entirely replaced by a palpable sense of defeat, not from combat, but from within. They were, Elias realized, now a perfect vintage of low-level, self-inflicted despair, precisely the kind Ixylos preferred. And the demon, casually stirring his thin porridge, seemed to radiate a quiet, contented hum that only Elias could truly perceive. The world, it seemed, was safe for now, protected by the most polite and most existentially unsettling of guardians. Chapter 12. The Traveler's Confession. The thin, persistent drizzle had returned with the morning. A familiar, almost comforting presence against the rattling pain of room 7. Elias Thorn woke, stretching out his weary limbs, the lumpy mattress yielding to his form with a familiar sigh. The air in the room, still carrying the faint, lingering scent of stale ale and residual, low-grade nightly despair, felt cool but not unwelcoming. He glanced across the narrow bed. Sulos was, as always, a picture of perfect, unnerving stillness. A dark silhouette against the paler sheets, his breathing so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The grey wool socks Elias had given him were still visible beneath the blanket, a curious testament to the mundane absurdities of their shared existence. Elias sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He had slept remarkably well, considering. The chaotic intrusion of the night, so terrifying in the moment, had been diffused with such elegant, subtle precision by Xylos that the aftermath felt more like a peculiar anecdote than a brush with genuine peril. The memory of the nights, now slumped and introspective in the common room below, their boisterousness replaced by a profound sense of existential weariness, was almost amusing. He pulled on his own boots, still damp, still stubbornly unyielding, their squeak a small, ordinary sound in the extraordinary quiet. As Elias finished lacing his boots, Xylos stirred. It was the familiar, languid unfolding, a slow, graceful transition from repose to full awareness. His amber eyes, impossibly bright in the dim light, opened and fixed on Elias. "Good morning, Mr. Thorn," Xylos murmured, his voice as smooth as polished obsidian, devoid of any hint of sleepiness. "I trust your nocturnal recuperation was undisturbed by the lingering resonance of the aforementioned boisterous intrusions? I believe the ambient field of collective ennui from below has, by and large, diminished to a manageable hum. A less volatile vintage of despair, certainly, than the raw aggression of yesterday evening." Elias managed a tired smile. "Manageable is one word for it, Xylos. At least they're not singing about goblins' bathwater anymore." He stood, stretching. Another day. Another futile search for my elusive clock mechanism, I suppose. And another bowl of Agnes's. Indeed, Xylos replied, rising with a dancer's grace. He swung his long, slender legs over the side of the bed, the grey wool socks a comfortable, if incongruous, presence on his feet. The consistent disappointment of a repetitive quest, I find, cultivates a particularly fine, slow-burning variety of resignation, a truly exquisite foundation for sustained existential ennui. One must appreciate the small victories, even in the absence of tangible achievement. They descended the creaking stairs together, a study in odd companionship. Elias, the rumpled human, and Xylos, the impeccably composed demon in his human guise, now with warm feet. The common room was, indeed, quieter than the previous evening. The night still lingered, some slumped over tables, others staring blankly into the sputtering hearth, their earlier bravado replaced by a palpable, collective weariness. Their faces were drawn, their movements sluggish. They picked at their breakfasts with a profound lack of enthusiasm, their conversations a desultory murmur of quiet complaints and vague anxieties about their purpose in life. Agnes, the innkeeper, moved among them with a curious blend of her usual scowl and a subtle, almost imperceptible air of satisfaction. Her grunts, Elias now realized, were not merely indifferent, but perhaps held a nuanced spectrum of emotional responses. Xylos selected a small, wobbly table in a quiet corner, away from the immediate aura of nightly despondency. Agnes brought their customary thin porridge and lukewarm tea. Elias stirred his, watching the faint steam rise from the bland surface, his mind already drifting to the inevitable dampness of the day ahead. Xylos, Elias began, after a prolonged silence, the only sound the faint clatter of a spoon against a bowl from another table. "I need to confess something." Xylos paused, his spoon hovering over his porridge, his amber eyes fixed on Elias, a flicker of analytical interest in their depths. "Oh, a confession. Mr. Thorne, this is unexpected. Is it perhaps related to a deeply held, yet unexamined, resentment towards the arbitrary nature of timekeeping devices? Or perhaps a fleeting thought of passive aggression towards Agnes for her culinary limitations?" Elias shook his head, a faint, almost bewildered smile touching his lips. "No, nothing so profound. It's just, I've been thinking since the knights arrived last night, and even before then, about sharing this room with you." He took a deep breath, the admission feeling oddly significant. "I have never, in all my travels, despite the various inns, the private rooms, the occasional hayloft, had a more restful night's sleep than I have had here, sharing a bed with you. Despite everything, a silence, thick and profound, settled between them, absorbing the faint sounds of the common room." Xylos remained utterly still, his amber eyes unblinking, studying Elias with an intensity that felt both piercing and strangely benevolent. He slowly lowered his spoon to the bowl, setting it down with a soft, almost reverent click. "Mr. Thorne?" Xylos murmured, his voice softer than Elias had ever heard it, carrying a faint note of something Elias could only describe as bewildered gratitude. That is enough entities for the Kizate. A truly remarkable statement. A confession indeed, of an entirely unexpected nature. I confess, it is a variable I had not anticipated in my prognostications of human emotional response to shared accommodations with my kind. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. You find repose, not disquiet. Comfort, not terror. Despite my undeniable, and often disarming, nature. Despite the culinary deficiencies of this establishment. Despite the occasional midnight snack of distilled despair, and the casual discussions of existential futility. There was a genuine note of curiosity, almost wonder, in his voice. Elias nodded, feeling the truth of it settle over him with a quiet certainty. Yes, all of it. The first night, I was terrified, I won't lie. But then you were so polite, and then you explained your consultancy with such impeccable logic, and you were so particular about the blanket and the pillow boundaries, and then the knitting, and then the socks, and then last night, with the nights. You just handled it so quietly, so efficiently. He chuckled, a dry, weary sound. It's like, for all the madness, there's a strange kind of order to it. A predictability. I know you're not going to try and, well, damnation me, as you put it. You're just observant and polite. And somehow, that's more reassuring than an empty room where you might still wake up to the gnawing worries of your own mind. Xylos continued to observe him, his expression one of deep, analytical contemplation. The human psyche, he mused, almost to himself, is a truly fascinating tapestry of contradictions. To find solace in the methodical application of existential erosion, simply because it is conducted with appropriate decorum, it is a most unexpected outcome. My previous bedfellows, while never physically harmed, certainly did not express such sheer, positive emotional resonance with our shared nocturnal arrangements. They left, as I recall, merely more resigned, or perhaps doubly convinced of the inherent pointlessness of their aspirations. Not rested. He paused. Then a faint, genuine smile, one that reached his amber eyes, touched his lips. It was a smile of profound intellectual satisfaction, mixed with a hint of genuine, if bewildered, pleasure. Mr. Thorne, your candid admission is, I assure you, a profoundly valuable piece of data. It suggests that even the most meticulously cultivated despair can, if delivered with sufficient politeness and a clear set of behavioral guidelines, unintentionally foster a sense of psychological stability. The predictable nature of an unconventional arrangement, it seems, can be more comforting than the unpredictable chaos of perceived freedom. This is a delightful paradox, a most intriguing development for my research into the human condition. Xylos reached out a slender, elegant hand, not to touch Elias, but to gesture towards the table between them, as if presenting a profound discovery. It means, Mr. Thorne, that my commitment to impeccable manners and efficient operation has, inadvertently, provided you with a form of therapeutic tranquility. The irony is, I confess, quite exquisite. I, who specialize in the gentle unraveling of mortal peace, have seemingly become a purveyor of restful slumber for you. It is a testament to the unforeseen complexities of interspecies interaction, would you not agree? And a rather amusing one, from my perspective. Perhaps I should consider adding bedside manner to my list of professional specializations. Elias chuckled, a genuine, unburdened sound. I think you already have. Xylos, you're quite good at it. He looked around the dim common room, at the slumped, despondent knights, at Agnes grunting behind the counter, at the thin, watery porridge before him. The world was still damp, still gray, still full of mundane disappointments and the quiet hum of human misery. But here, in this quiet corner, sharing a peculiar breakfast with a demon who was genuinely, analytically pleased that his presence fostered restful sleep, Elias felt a strange, almost profound sense of peace. The absurdity was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace, something that made life, however strange, utterly, uniquely interesting. He had come to the slumbering soul seeking a clock mechanism, and instead, he had found something far more intricate and far more perfectly timed, in the polite demon beside him. The most restful nights of his life, it turned out, came not from solitude, but from the surprisingly comfortable company of existential dread and meticulously negotiated blanket space. He finished his lukewarm tea, a faint, almost contented smile on his face, the taste of unexpected tranquility mingling with the memory of rain and quiet hums. Chapter 13. The Demon's Parting Gift. The thin, persistent drizzle, a melancholic but now strangely familiar refrain, continued its tireless performance against the rattling pane of room 7. Elias Thorne stirred, feeling the familiar contours of the lumpy mattress beneath him, and stretched his weary limbs. The air in the room, cool and carrying the faint, lingering scent of damp plaster, and the residual, low-grade ennui from the departed nights, felt curiously poignant this morning. He glanced across the narrow expanse of the shared bed. Xylos was, as always, a study in elegant repose, utterly still beneath the thin blanket, his presence a quiet, almost domestic hum that had become an unexpected anchor in Elias' tumultuous journey. The gray wool socks, Elias' mundane offering, were still visible, a faint, comforting absurdity at the demon's feet. Elias sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His dreams, for once, had been remarkably unburdened by philosophical paradoxes or the intricacies of clock mechanisms. He had dreamt, vaguely, of a warm, quiet room, strangely free of the usual anxieties that plagued his restless nights. He pulled on his own boots, still stubbornly damp despite his best efforts, their leather groaning a familiar protest. Today, he knew, was the day he would have to move on. His funds were all but depleted. His pursuit of the elusive clock mechanism proved utterly fruitless, and the inn, for all its peculiar comforts, was not a place he could afford to linger indefinitely. He felt a faint pang of something akin to wistfulness at the thought of leaving, a surprising emotion given the circumstances. As Elias finished lacing his boots, Zelos stirred. It was the familiar, languid unfolding, a slow, graceful transition from repose to full awareness that never failed to fascinate Elias. His amber eyes, impossibly bright in the dim morning light, opened and fixed on Elias. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Zelos murmured, his voice as smooth as polished obsidian, devoid of any hint of sleepiness. "I trust your nocturnal recuperation was sufficiently restorative? I detected a subtle shift in your atmospheric emanations this morning, a faint tremor of impending departure. Am I correct in my assessment that your pragmatic inclinations are asserting themselves, urging you towards the inevitable continuation of your journey?" Elias sighed, running a hand through his perpetually unruly hair. "You are, as always, unsettlingly accurate. My funds are exhausted, and the clock mechanism remains as elusive as ever. I must move on today. Sake my fortune, or at least my next meal. Elsewhere." He felt a strange lightness in admitting it, a quiet acceptance of the futility, perhaps subtly influenced by Xylos' pervasive philosophies. "A regrettable, but entirely predictable, turn of events," Zelos replied, swinging his long, slender legs over the side of the bed. The gray wool socks, a soft, mundane counterpoint to his otherworldly presence, were clearly visible. The pursuit of elusive objectives, particularly when driven by a sense of external obligation rather than inherent passion, often culminates in such a juncture. It provides an excellent opportunity for cultivating a fresh batch of low-level existential disappointment. Should you be inclined. He rose, moving towards the chipped basin to perform his morning ablutions, his movements as fluid and precise as ever. Elias merely grunted, gathering his meager belongings. The inn common room below was quieter than usual, the knights having ridden out at dawn, leaving behind only a faint, lingering aura of exhaustion and mild, generalized regret. Agnes, the innkeeper, offered her usual non-committal grunt as Elias paid for his last meal, the customary thin porridge and lukewarm tea. Zelos, as was his custom, paid in advance, a gesture that always seemed to impress Agnes, though she never overtly acknowledged it. They sat at their usual wobbly table in the corner, the morning light doing little to dispel the inn's inherent gloom. The porridge was as bland as ever, the tea as insipid, but Elias, surprisingly, found himself eating with a strange sense of quiet enjoyment. His conversation with Alos had transformed the inn from a miserable waypoint into a bizarre, yet comforting, haven of philosophical absurdity. "Mr. Thorne," Zelos began, placing his spoon down with a soft click, his amber eyes fixed on Elias. "Given your impending departure, and our rather unique period of shared accommodation, I find myself moved to offer you a small token of my appreciation." Elias blinked, genuinely surprised. "Appreciation? For what, Zelos? My snoring, perhaps? Or my general lack of interesting despair?" Silas chuckled, a low purring sound. "Quite the contrary, Mr. Thorne. For your remarkable adaptability, your capacity for polite coexistence in the face of profound anomaly, and, dare I say, for providing me with a fascinating new data point in my ongoing research into the unpredictable nature of mortal comfort. The notion that my presence, despite my profession, could induce a state of restful slumber is, as I mentioned, a truly delightful paradox." He reached into the inner pocket of his dark tunic and withdrew a small object. It was a stone, not particularly large, perhaps the size of a pigeon's egg, and smooth, gray, and utterly unremarkable in appearance. Save for one thing, it emanated a faint, consistent warmth. Elias had seen heated stones used in beds before, but they were always wrapped in cloth, radiating a dying heat. This one simply sat there, glowing with an internal, unwavering warmth, as if it had just been pulled from a slow-burning ember. There was no visible source of heat, no smoke, no discernible magic, just a gentle, inviting warmth that seemed to ripple through the air around it. Silas placed it on the table between them, the warmth immediately noticeable against the cool wood. This, he announced, his voice imbued with a quiet pride, is a thermodynamically stable silicate composite. I have, over a period of many centuries, imbued it with certain energetic properties that allow it to maintain a consistent, agreeable warmth, entirely independent of external heat sources. Think of it as a personal, portable hot brick, but without the inconvenience of repeated heating. Elias stared at the stone, then at Silas. A self-heating stone? Precisely, Silas affirmed. Its primary function is, as you might infer, thermal regulation. For chilly nights, Mr. Thorne. Particularly for those chilly nights without a demon. He paused, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. I recall your observation regarding your feet, feeling as though they had been left out overnight to cure. This device, I believe, will alleviate such discomforts. It can be placed in a bed, beneath one's garments, or simply held in the hand. It will radiate a soothing warmth, calibrated to optimal human comfort. Indefinitely, Elias reached out hesitantly and picked up the stone. It was smooth beneath his fingers, and the warmth, though gentle, was remarkably penetrating, seeping into his palm and up his arm, dispelling the lingering chill from the inn. It felt utterly mundane, yet entirely miraculous. This is remarkable, Silas. But why? A gesture of goodwill, Mr. Thorne, and a practical application of advanced energetics. As I mentioned, your unsolicited act of sock provision provided me with a delightful new data point regarding mortal benevolence. It seemed only appropriate to reciprocate with a practical application of my own capabilities. Consider it a testament to the unexpected benefits of interspecies civility, and a subtle reminder that even in the absence of an immediate demonic presence, one can still find unexpected comforts in the cold vastness of existence. Silas's amber eyes gleamed with a quiet amusement. It is also, of course, a far more efficient method of expressing gratitude than, say, a fleeting burst of localized infernal warmth, which, while effective, tends to be rather dramatic and often leaves behind regrettable charring. Elias clutched the warm stone in his hand, feeling a strange mix of profound bewilderment and unexpected gratitude. A demon, whose entire purpose was the cultivation of despair, was giving him a self-heating stone, a mundane comfort, as a parting gift. The world, he realized, was not just strange, it was beautifully, ridiculously, profoundly absurd. Thank you, Silas, Elias said, his voice softer than he intended. Truly, this is an extraordinary gift. My pleasure, Mr. Thorne, Silas replied, rising gracefully from the table. He stood taller than Elias, his dark eyes holding ancient depths. I trust your continued journey will be, if not entirely fulfilling, then at least rich in observational opportunities for subtle disillusionment. And should you encounter any particularly promising sources of low-grade bureaucratic frustration, do feel free to send a mental dispatch. One is always open to new professional avenues, particularly those that offer a clean, sustainable harvest. Elias managed a weak chuckle. I'll keep that in mind, Silas. And you? Continue to enjoy your contemplative knitting and your very particular tea. Indeed, Mr. Thorne, one must maintain one's hobbies and preferences. They provide a vital structure to an otherwise fluid existence. Farewell. And do endeavor to maintain a healthy level of existential ambiguity. It keeps the mind supple. Tulos inclined his head in a polite, final bow. Elias clutched the warm stone, feeling its comforting heat against his palm. He walked to the inn door, the familiar squeal its hinges a final lament. He stepped out into the drizzly gray morning, the worn cobblestones slick beneath his boots. The world outside the slumbering sow was exactly as he had left it, damp, unremarkable, and filled with the promise of more futile pursuits. But Elias Thorne, the weary traveler, was no longer quite the same. He carried with him not just the memory of a bizarre, polite demon, but a small, self-heating stone, a tangible reminder of the unexpected comforts found in the most absurd of circumstances. His search for a clock mechanism now seemed infinitely less important than the peculiar warmth in his hand, a warmth gifted by a creature of despair for chilly nights without a demon. And as he walked, a faint, almost contented smile touched his lips, knowing that even in the vast, indifferent world, sometimes all you needed was a good pair of socks, a polite demon, and a curiously warm stone to make the night, and perhaps even life itself, surprisingly comfortable. Chapter 14. The Innkeeper's Bewilderment. The morning after Elias Thorne's departure from the slumbering sow dawned with the same relentless, thin drizzle that seemed to be the inn's perpetual companion. Agnes, the innkeeper, was already about her duties. Her movements, methodical and imbued with the weary efficiency of years, spent catering to the unpredictable whims of travelers. Her formidable girth moved with surprising agility as she refilled the common room's meager oil lamps, swept the perpetually damp flagstones, and wiped down the chipped mugs with a cloth that had seen more historical events than most local dignitaries. The scent of stale ale, wood smoke, and the faint, acrid tang left by the recently departed nights still hung heavy in the air, a familiar aroma of morning afters. Agnes rarely spared a thought for her guests once they were gone, considering them ephemeral disturbances in the otherwise monotonous rhythm of her life. They came, they stayed, they left, and usually they left behind only a few coppers and a lingering mess. But this morning, a faint, almost imperceptible prickle of unease threaded through her usual stoicism. It was the feeling one gets when a fly buzzes too close to the ear, or a floorboard creaks where it shouldn't, an unnameable disturbance to the established order of things. She had seen Elias Thorne off, the man with the perpetually damp boots, and the strange, quiet companion. He had paid his due, with a surprising lack of complaint about the porridge, and had merely grunted a farewell before stepping out into the drizzle, clutching something small and gray in his hand that seemed to radiate a faint warmth. Agnes had watched him go, then turned her attention to the scattered remnants of the night's revelry. They had left a truly impressive mess, along with a pervasive atmosphere of mild, philosophical self-pity that was unusual, even for her establishment. She had noticed it too, the way their boisterousness had simply evaporated overnight, replaced by a sullen, almost mournful quietude. It was very unlike drunken nights, very unlike them indeed. Agnes had merely grunted at the phenomenon, attributing it to a particularly potent batch of ale, or perhaps some peculiar atmospheric pressure. She did not bother herself with fanciful notions. It was when she finally ascended the creaking stairs to begin cleaning the guest rooms that the prickle of unease began to sharpen into something more defined. Ryan is 7. The room Elias Thorne had shared. Or rather, the room Elias Thorne had been forced to share, given the inn's unfortunate lack of vacancies. A fact Agnes found rather amusing. She pushed open the heavy oak door, which swung inward with its familiar arthritic groan. The room was dim, the single window rattling in a non-existent breeze. The threadbare rug lay rumpled, and the small, rickety stand with the chipped basin still held a bar of soap, smelling faintly of frankincense and myrrh. All as it should be. But the bed, the single, narrow bed, that barely accommodated 1.5 men. It was too neat. Elias Thorne was a traveler, a man of rough habits, not given to fastidious bed-making. Yet, the thin blanket, though rumpled on Elias's side where he had flung it back, lay strangely pristine on the other. The pillow, though flat, was subtly indented in 2 places, as if 2 heads had rested upon it. But one impression was softer, more defined than the other, and on the side where Elias's peculiar bedfellow, Silas, had slept. The sheet was folded back with an almost unnatural precision, its corner neatly tucked, as if by an invisible hand. It was a small detail, but it screamed of a meticulousness that was entirely out of place in her inn. Agnes, who prided herself on her attention to such mundane details, found herself frowning. She approached the bed, her heavy boots thudding softly on the uneven floorboards. Her gaze dropped to the floor beside the bed. Elias Thorne's boots, still damp, had left faint, muddy smudges near the door, a typical trail of a weary traveler. But there should have been another set. Silas, the quiet one, the one who paid in advance, had worn simple but immaculately clean leather boots. He had, Agnes recalled, slipped them on with a peculiar grace each morning before descending for breakfast. And he had, by all rights, walked across the same damp floorboards. Yet there was no second set of tracks, no faint smudges of clean leather or the residue of an alien dust. Nothing. The floorboards on Silas's side of the bed were simply clean, pristine, as if he had floated, or simply ceased to exist the moment he left the mattress. Agnes squinted, leaning closer, her brow furrowed in bewilderment. She ran a calloused hand over the rough wood, expecting to feel some faint stickiness, some residue. But there was nothing, just the cold, unyielding wood. Pine. She grunted, a sound of profound bafflement. It defied logic. Humans, even quiet ones, left footprints. Always. This was an anomaly her practical mind refused to reconcile. Then she caught it. A faint, almost imperceptible scent that seemed to cling to the air around the bed, particularly on Silas's side. It was not the familiar mustiness of the inn, nor the lingering ale, nor even the fading scent of Elias' damp wool. It was a peculiar, impossible combination. An earthy, almost sulfuric tang, sharp and hinting at something ancient and primal, yet strangely clean, devoid of the usual stench of ash or decay, and intertwined with it, weaving through the acrid note, was something else, the delicate, soothing perfume of lavender. Agnes sniffed, her nostrils flaring, trying to identify the source. Brimstone and lavender. The 2 aromas could not, coexist. Brimstone was the smell of volcanic vents, of strange, burning earth. Lavender was the scent of sun-dried linen, of quiet gardens, of comforting sachets in a chest. They were antithetical, impossible partners. Yet here they were, mingling subtly, creating a phantom perfume that made the very air seem to vibrate with an unexplainable contradiction. It wasn't strong enough to be overpowering, merely a lingering ghost, a testament to something that had been there, and then, inexplicably, was not. She stared at the space where Silas had been. The neatly folded sheet, the single pillow with its 2 perfect indentation, the utterly clean floorboards, and that impossible, haunting scent. Agnes had lived a long life in this inn. She had seen drunks brawl, lovers quarrel, traveling merchants peddle cursed trinkets. and even a rogue priest attempt an exorcism on a particularly persistent mouse. She had dealt with peculiar individuals, odd habits, and inexplicable disappearances of small valuables. But this was different. This was a direct assault on the very fabric of mundane reality. It was too quiet, too clean, too impossible. Her mind, usually so resistant to anything that deviated from the practical, struggled to form a coherent thought. A customer, a quiet, polite one, who paid in advance, who left no footprints, who smelled of brimstone and lavender. It was as if the laws of cause and effect, of physical presence and lingering trace, had simply ceased to apply to him. She moved away from the bed, a faint shiver tracing its way down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold of the room. She looked at her own calloused hands, her familiar solid boots on the familiar solid floor. She was real. The inn was real. Elias Thorne was real, with his damp boots and his futile quest. But Xylos was a question mark etched into the very air of room 7. A riddle composed of impossible scents and absent traces. Agnes grunted again, louder this time. A sound that conveyed a deep, wordless frustration. She would clean the room. She would change the sheets, scrub the floor, air out the peculiar perfume. She would then descend to the common room and resume her duties, ignoring the lingering weariness of the nights and the never-ending drizzle outside. She would tell herself it was a draught, or some odd herb Elias Thorne had carried, or simply the lingering fumes of too much cheap ale playing tricks on her nose. She would dismiss it, because the alternative was a reality far too peculiar, far too unsettling, for a practical innkeeper to ever acknowledge. She picked up the chipped basin, the frankincense and myrrh soap still smelling faintly clean and invigorating. She would have to replace the sheets, and she would tell no one, not a soul, for some mysteries Agnes decided were best left undisturbed even by the most bewildered of innkeepers. And as she left room 7, the impossible scent of brimstone and lavender seemed to linger behind her, a quiet, polite ghost in the air, a testament to the fact that some visitors, however well-mannered, left traces that defied all common sense. The world, it seemed, was far stranger than even Agnes had allowed herself to believe. Chapter 15. The Traveler's Newfound Reputation. Elias Thorne had left the slumbering sow behind, but the slumbering sow had, it seemed, left an indelible mark on him. Or more accurately, the peculiar inhabitant of room 7 had, as he walked, the thin drizzle of familiar presence against his face, the small, gray, self-heating stone nestled in his palm radiated a gentle, unwavering warmth. It was a tangible anchor, a mundane miracle, in a world that had, irrevocably, tilted on its axis. He resumed his journey, the futile search for the elusive clock mechanism, now feeling less like an obligation and more like a gentle, purposeful meandering. He sought out inns, not for the promise of a rare artifact, but for the simple, comforting rhythm of the road. And as he traveled, the world, surprisingly, began to change around him. The first inklings came subtly. In a village inn, a few days' ride from the slumbering sow, Elias was nursing a rather watery ale when a group of grizzled merchants began to tell a wild tale. It was the story of a band of boisterous knights, known for their raucous revelry, who had recently passed through their village, strangely subdued. They had been seen. The merchants swore with a peculiar, almost melancholic air, muttering about the futility of ambition and the crushing weight of their own insignificance. One merchant, a portly man with a perpetually nervous tic, recounted hearing one knight lamenting the existential cost of mending his armor. Elias listened, his heart doing a peculiar little dance of recognition. The knights. Xylos's subtle intervention. He merely sipped his ale, a faint private smile touching his lips. He was, after all, an eyewitness to the source of their profound, yet polite, despair. The rumors, however, soon became more direct. Weeks later, in a bustling market town, Elias found himself setting up his small, portable workbench to repair a local tailor's temperamental grandfather clock. As he meticulously examined the intricate gears, a woman paused, clutching a basket of fresh eggs. "Are you the Elias Thorne?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "The one who shared a room with something not of this world?" Elias paused, his tiny screwdriver hovering over a delicate escapement. He had gained a reputation, it seemed, a rather specific one. Word had spread, carried on the damp winds and through the garrulous networks of traveling merchants, gossiping peddlers, and, no doubt, the occasionally more sober knight. The story, naturally, was embellished, distorted, and simplified with each retelling. It began, Elias pieced together, with the demoralized knights who, unable to articulate the subtle existential dread that had befallen them, could only speak of an inn where two quiet men had inexplicably drained their spirits, leaving them with an overwhelming sense of life's pointlessness. This, combined with Agnes's own bewildering experience in room 7, the vanished footprints, the unnatural tidiness, the impossible scent of brimstone and lavender, had cemented the legend. Elias Thorne, the weary traveler, had shared a bed with a demon, and, miraculously, he had lived. This, the core of the legend, was universally believed. It was dramatic, terrifying, and fit neatly into the common understanding of demonic encounters. Elias found himself approached by people who wished to gaze upon a man who had stared into the abyss and emerged. Some asked for blessings, others for protection. A few even inquired if he had gained any arcane knowledge. He had, though not the kind they envisioned. His clock repair business, paradoxically, gained a strange sort of notoriety. Clients, instead of merely asking for their timepieces to be fixed, would hover, whispering, trying to glean some hint of the infernal from his presence. They wanted to hear the story, and Elias, pragmatic to his core, eventually learned to tell it. He would describe the dim inn, the lumpy bed, the precise negotiation of blanket boundaries. He would recount Ixylos's elegant politeness, his philosophical musings on existential despair, his preference for lukewarm tea over coffee, and his meticulous nocturnal ablutions. He would try to explain the utter, profound absurdity of it all, the dry wit that seasoned every terrifying revelation. He would, in short, tell the truth. And it was always at this point that the disbelief would set in. He said he was a consultant in existential despair. A farmer would scoff, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. And that he fed on feelings? Nonsense. Demons demand souls. And they do it with fire and torment, but it was the knitting that truly baffled them. And he had a hobby, Elias would patiently explain. His voice devoid of any humor, he knitted tiny sweaters for imps from the distilled essence of human disappointment. He was quite particular about the yarn properties. At this, the laughter would erupt, hearty, booming, incredulous laughter that shook the rafters of common rooms and workshops alike. A demon who, "Im Knitzing," a blacksmith once roared, clutching his belly. And for imps? You must be mad, old man. They're fiends of the pit, not chilly apprentices. The idea of a demon, a creature of cosmic malevolence, engaged in such a profoundly mundane and domestic activity, was simply beyond mortal comprehension. It shattered their carefully constructed understanding of evil in a way that grander horrors never could. They could accept a man surviving hellfire, but not a demon wielding knitting needles. Elias would merely sigh, a sound of profound, weary resignation, and returned to his clockwork. He had stopped trying to convince them. The truth, he realized, was far too absurd to be believed. People preferred their demons to be unambiguously evil, their encounters dramatically perilous, and their legends unequivocally sensational. The nuanced, polite, and absurd reality of Silos, the consultant demon with a passion for knitting, was simply too much to process. It made the world too strange, too unpredictable in its mundane detail. His reputation, therefore, became a strange tapestry woven from sensationalism and utter disbelief. He was Elias Thorne, the man who shared a bed with a demon, and occasionally Elias Thorne, the madman who claims demons knit. He found that the latter often drew more curious glances than the former. He sometimes wondered if Exilos, wherever he was subtly influencing this narrative, perhaps finding the resultant bewilderment a particularly fine vintage of human confusion. Elias continued his travels, the self-heating stone always a quiet, constant warmth in his pocket, a secret comfort against the lingering chill of the road and the pervasive absurdity of life. He still sought out clock mechanisms, though with less urgency, more a gentle, meandering curiosity. He still slept in various inns, sometimes alone, sometimes sharing with burly drovers or snoring merchants, but none possessed the peculiar, quiet comfort of room 7. He missed the precise blanket negotiations, the dry philosophical debates, the subtle hum of Exilos's presence. He missed the demon's impeccable manners, his logical approach to existential despair, and even the slightly unsettling scent of frankincense, myrrh, and unidentifiable earthy sweetness. He had discovered that the most truly restful nights of his life were not those spent in solitary peace, but those spent in the bewildering, yet strangely reassuring, company of a demon who prioritized civility, efficiency, and the perfect stitch for an imp's sweater. The world was still full of dampness, discomfort, and the inevitable disappointments that provided Xylos his sustenance. But Elias Thorne, the unassuming clock repairman, now navigated it with a peculiar internal serenity, a quiet understanding that the most profound truths were often found in the most absurd details. And sometimes, he thought, as the warm stone pulsed gently in his hand beneath the rough fabric of his trousers, the most comforting thing in a cold, uncertain world was the knowledge that even a demon, a true being of infernal origin, could simply be a polite, meticulous, and surprisingly cold-footed roommate who just needed a good pair of socks and a quiet place to knit.